I'm Katerina Zakaria. I'm the chair of classics and archaeology, and this is my 25th year at LMU. So I've been here for a very long time, and I have a lot to celebrate. I celebrate the fact that we have one of the most vibrant departments because of our students. This is one of our favorite days in the year. We showcase the work of students and faculty, so you'll allow me at different moments when we have like even a couple of minutes, I'll introduce each one of our adjuncts because I want you to get to know them. And you're gonna hear what all our students have been doing with our faculty. So this is a celebration for us. As you can tell, we have some student presentations of students who are not seniors. And then we have the senior capstone presentations, and this is a requirement for our major. So that's also something that I'm sure you'll enjoy. And then we'll have a period of announcing awards for the department, a faculty presentation, and Greek lunch served at the back. So let's start by introducing Ben Radcliffe. So let me bring my laptop here. So Ben, like myself, he's a Hellenist. His field is epic and Greek drama. And this year he's been with us for, I guess, 4 years. So I think I'm allowed to say that we're celebrating both for Ben Radcliffe and Heidi Fessler their promotion to senior lecturer. It's a little bit, we're waiting for the announcement, but we can actually, this is the moment we can share this because I know that we've done everything, they've done everything for us. I want you to understand what it means for people who don't have tenure to be giving as much as Ben and Heidi, who also put together this whole program. It means that they come in and teach our students being paid per course with little support. And I just want to acknowledge them as my department only has 2 tenure lines right now. And all the work that you will hear about has been done primarily by this wonderful faculty who come and teach our students, and because they love the students and they love the topic. And we still can give them permanent positions. So I really recognize you, celebrate you, and thank you. So let me say also what else Ben has done. He gave talks at the Society of Classical Studies in January and at the American Comparative Literature Association in March, published an article in February on the myth of Niobe and the Iliad, received a grant representing our department on global local courses that we have put together, and also received another grant with Elliot Piros, and you'll hear more about that, working on classics and technology. So Ben, all right.
Hi everyone, I'm Ben, so I'm actually here to introduce our first speaker today, Tanya Rashisa, who is a junior and a double major in English and classics and archaeology. Since she declared her major last spring, I believe, she has been blazing a very distinguished path through the classics and archaeology curriculum, and she's an extremely welcome presence in the department. So the talk today is something based on a paper that Tanya wrote for my Greek and Roman religions course that I teach every semester. This was back in the fall. And she chose characteristically an especially challenging and fascinating topic. It's essentially about a kind of religious counterculture movement in archaic and classical Greece called Pythagoreanism. So it's a very exciting topic, and I'm glad that Tanya will be presenting. So here she is.
Hello everyone, my name is Tanya. I'm a junior. I'm double majoring in English and classics and archaeology. So last semester in the fall, I took a class with Dr. Radcliffe called Greek and Roman Religions, which I really enjoyed and would recommend for anyone who hasn't taken it yet. So for my final research project, I decided to write about Pythagoreanism. So you may already be familiar with the figure Pythagoras, probably from math class. His name is associated with a famous theorem in geometry, also called the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So Pythagoras is mostly remembered today for his contributions to science, mathematics, and Western philosophy. He was a major influence on both Plato and Aristotle. But what not a lot of people know about him is that he was also the founder of a religious sect called Pythagoreanism. So Pythagoras was born on the Greek island of Samos sometime in the 6th century BCE, and he moved to Croton, which is in southern Italy, around 530 BCE. And Croton is where he would eventually establish his cult. So there he is depicted in Raphael's fresco, The School of Athens. So a young man is showing him a tablet with a drawing of a tetrad, the little triangular figure, which Pythagoras is credited for inventing and later became a sacred symbol in Pythagoreanism. So the author Walter Burkert describes Pythagoras as a shamanistic figure, a charismatic spiritual leader and organizer who exercised a great influence on the civic life of Magna Graecia. So Magna Graecia is a term that ancient Romans used to call the Greek-speaking coastal areas of southern Italy. So Pythagoras never wrote anything himself, and there are no detailed accounts of his thought written by his contemporaries. So most of the sources we have on Pythagoras, his cult, and their practices were written decades or centuries after his death. And there's a lot of discrepancy among those sources, which I'll touch upon later. So Pythagoras has many doctrines, and I won't get into all of them today, but based on the sources we have, one of Pythagoras' main doctrines is metempsychosis, or the transmigration and the immortality of the soul. So the Pythagoreans believed that the soul is reincarnated and reborn into different forms, both human and non-human, including animals. So in a quote from the philosopher Xenophanes, Pythagoras is mocked for saying, "Stop beating that dog. From his cries I recognize the ghost or suke of a friend." So this Pythagorean doctrine was known even to those in the early modern period, because in one of Shakespeare's plays, The Merchant of Venice, the character Gratiano says, "Thou almost makes me waver in my faith to hold opinion with Pythagoras that souls of animals infuse themselves into the trunks of men." So because it is believed that they believed in metempsychosis, it is also alleged that the Pythagoreans practiced vegetarianism. Because if you believe that an animal could be the soul of a deceased relative or loved one, then it would make sense for you to abstain from eating meat. So one of Plato's students, Eudoxus, says that Pythagoras practiced the greatest purity and was shocked at all bloodshedding and killing, that he not only abstained from animal food, but never in any way approached butchers or hunters. So, fun facts, the word vegetarian wasn't coined in the English language until the mid-19th century. So before then, the term Pythagorean was used to describe anyone who abstained from eating meat. So if you're vegan or vegetarian, you can call yourself a Pythagorean. So one vocal point of mainstream ancient Greek religion or civic cult is animal sacrifice. And an important step in the sacrificial process is consuming or eating the entrails of the victim. So if the Pythagoreans believed in metempsychosis and were in fact vegetarians, then they wouldn't have done or practiced these sacrifices. And according to Walter Burkert, to renounce animal sacrifice would have been more than religious reform. It would have meant a complete overturn of traditional ways. However, we do have some sources that suggest that Pythagoras and his followers weren't fully vegetarian. So Aristoxenus, one of Aristotle's students, stated that Pythagoras only avoided eating plow oxen and rams, and he was especially fond of the meat from tender young kids, as in young goats, sucking pigs, and cockerels. In fact, so the animals whose meats were favored by Pythagoras were actually the most important sacrificial animals in the mystery cults of Demeter and Dionysus. So Iamblichus, the Neoplatonic philosopher, also stated that for the Pythagoreans, the only animals into which the souls of men do not enter are those which may, according to law, be sacrificed. So So this is how they could have gone around the whole idea of metempsychosis and still participate in animal sacrifices. So the Pythagoreans may have eaten animals that were sacrificed, but just not the meat of non-sacrificial animals. So their dietary restrictions might have still accommodated civic religion. Pythagoras is also famously associated with a taboo on beans. So the author Walter Burkert states that this was a favorite target of those who would mock Pythagoreanism. So according to Aristotle in his work on the Pythagoreans, Pythagoras counseled abstinence from beans either because they're like the genitals or because they're like the gates of Hades. And this is another source that tells us that the Pythagoreans believe that if a bean is moistened and placed in a pitcher and buried, when we dig it up days later, we will find a disturbingly familiar form growing, the head of a human child. This is one of my favorite drawings of all time. It's a French manuscript from the 1500s, and it depicts Pythagoras, and he's turning away from fava beans. So lastly, this is a painting by Sir Peter Paul Rubens. It's on display at the Hampton Court Palace in the UK, and it depicts a scene from Ovid's Metamorphoses, an ancient Roman poem. So it depicts a scene, as I said, it depicts a scene from Ovid's Metamorphoses. So in book 15 of the poem, Numa Pompilius, the second legendary king of Rome after Romulus, goes to Croton and meets with Pythagoras. So that's Numa on the far left, and Pythagoras is the one sitting on the tree, and behind him are all his followers. And if you look closely, there's a bean, a plant under his foot, and that's a reference to his refusal to eat beans. During their encounter, Pythagoras delivers a long speech advocating for vegetarianism. So he says, "O human race, you feed, you feast upon your kill. Do not do this, I pray you. But remember, when you taste the flesh of slaughtered cattle, you're eating your fellow workers. Our souls are deathless always when they leave our bodies. They find new dwelling places. I myself, I well remember, in the Trojan War was Pantheus' son, Eupherbus, and my breast once knew the heavy spear of Menelaus. As the pliant wax is stamped with new designs and is no longer what once it was, but changes form, and still is pliant wax, so do I teach that spirit is evermore the same, though passing always to ever-changing bodies. So I warn you, lest appetite murder brotherhood. I warned you by all the priesthood in me, do not exile what may be kindred souls by evil slaughter. Blood should not nourish blood." These are my sources. Thank you.
So we have some time for questions. Would people like to ask Tanya anything about her talk?
Yes.
I'm curious if in your study of Pythagoras, anything came up about how similar it is to Hinduism.
Oh, yeah. Not during my research, but I could see the similarities between the two, especially with the doctrine of vegetarianism and metempsychosis, because they do believe in reincarnation in Hinduism and in Buddhism as well. But nothing really came up in my research.
So it's supposed to be just coincidental?
I would have to research more about that.
Maybe.
Yes?
So I'm a little curious about this beans being like the gates of Hades. Can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, when I first saw that, I was like, this is kind of weird. But yeah, the whole like bean taboo is really famously associated with Pythagoras. There's a lot of different reasons for it. I couldn't really make out because there's not a lot of like elaboration on it. But yeah, most of the reasons are tied with the doctrine of metempsychosis, that the souls are infused in non-human forms as well, including beings. So that could have been a reason why they didn't eat it. But yeah, I just thought it was
Anything digestive? No?
I mean, yes.
We'll have to think about that, yeah. All right, so I think, let me say something more about Tanya here, okay? Let's put her on the spot. Tanya, like Clara last year, received the Jewish internship and will be going for 1 month to Crete as Clara did last year, and that's a new internship that we're very lucky to have landed for our students. So when are you leaving?
June, mid-June.
Mid-June. So she will continue where Clara left it, and hopefully next year we might have somebody else. So we'll hear more when my colleague Caroline, who's here, can tell us more about archaeological excavations as the students while they're presenting on capstones. But these are some of our summer events or summer internships and field work that we celebrate. So congratulations to Tanya.
One more question for Tanya.
Oh, yeah.
Aside from the immortality of the soul, did any of Pythagoras studied geometry or kind of how that relates to I guess theories of form? Did that kind of influence how the cult was supposed to behave or any of their doctrine?
Yeah, definitely. Because a lot of Pythagoras' doctrines are involved with math and science and with the whole harmony of spheres and everything. But I couldn't really get into all of that because math isn't my strongest suit. So I just chose vegetarianism to focus on for this project. But yeah, it definitely plays a role.
Cool.
Yes, Clara.
Do you think his aversion to beings, within his ideology, has a little bit to do with how bean plants have the ability to kind of cleanse the soil, so they more or less can absorb the carcasses that are still in the soil, making them kind of meat adjacent, I guess, in his line of thought?
That didn't come up in my research, but that is a good possible theory for that, because it would make sense, yeah. Yes, Kat.
And I have a question about vegetarianism in general, because Pythagoras thought that the souls of people could go into the bodies of animals, right? Is that the same with plants or not? Because then, if it's the same with plants and you're still eating plants in vegetarianism, then there's a problem, right?
Right, I think for them it's also the act of killing, with a sentient being that also gets to them, because I guess they saw a lot more similarities between humans and animals as sentient creatures than with plants.
I was wondering why if you had sort of developed an opinion about why so many generations of thinkers and artists in the ancient world, and also the Renaissance sources you brought up, why they found Pythagoras and Pythagoreanism so interesting. What sort of attracted people to this idea over so many generations?
I think it's because he was very eccentric.
Yeah.
The figure of Pythagoras himself. There were a lot of theories that he performed a katabasis. He went to the underworld and he could be in two places at the same time. And I think that he sort of went outside the status quo, with whole his vegetarian diet and his whole belief in reincarnation. I think they just saw that as very unique, especially within the context of Greek civic cult. That's why it endured for so many long years.
Okay, so here is what I think I'll do is I'll take a moment to introduce some of the faculty since we have a little bit of time, okay? So Tanya, thank you again. So in no particular order, but since you're hearing questions from faculty, I want to take a moment wherever we are, we seem to have a bit of extra time to introduce a few of the faculty. So you heard Jordan Christopher ask a question there at the back. So Jordan is an alum, so he graduated, I think, in 2009.
2013, I believe.
13, okay. Well, time is fluid for me. And he's a specialist in the historical analysis of ancient Greece, Rome, and China. His work specifically explores the interplay between culture, beliefs, and political developments. He has a forthcoming book, currently contracted with Cambridge University Press. The title is The Pioneer Kingdoms of Macedon and Queen, A Triumph of the Periphery, as he is a comparatist comparing Hellenistic Greece to early China. Separately, the edited volume based on the conference he organized in Germany, in Münster, Germany in 2022, Post-Colonial Perspectives on Global Antiquities, has also been contracted with Routledge. Here with us, he teaches courses on ancient historians, ancient China, ancient warfare, and theories of the Axial Age, while also creating and running the LMU Roman reenactment program. And you're all invited to the event that we'll have on Saturday at the Dionysus Festival, where there will be a Roman reenactment. How am I doing with time? 5 more minutes I'll take. And introduce Nadia Ben Marzouk. So Nadia is there. Nadia is teaching, hello, yes. Nadia is teaching ancient Jerusalem class and is an archaeologist who works in the region. She received a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship to begin writing her second book. This is big deal, and so congratulations, Nadia. This is extraordinary. Nadia has her PhD from UCLA in Levantine archaeology, and before joining LMU this year, had a 3-year postdoc funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation in Zurich and Tel Aviv, where she developed an open access database for all stamp seals from excavated context in the region. Nadia's work looks at the context of technological innovation in the Bronze and Iron Age East Mediterranean through the lens of craft production. Starting in July, pending the stability in the region, she will be the NEH Fellow at the W.F. Albright Institute of Archaeology in Jerusalem for 6 months, where she will begin working on her book, Crafting Communities into Contact, investigating the roles of specialist producers in the making of an East Mediterranean exchange system, 2500 to 1500 BC. The book will argue for the central role that craftspeople played in connecting communities in the Mediterranean by exploring the rise and spread of new technological innovations, including the emergence of new writing systems like Cretan hieroglyphs, the early alphabet, and other communicative systems. So that is our Nadia. Thanks, Nadia. And last, for the moment, we'll have to pick this up again with other people. I will introduce briefly Dr. Elliot Quiros, who is going to come and introduce the next student presenter. So Elliot has been teaching here for, I think, 5 semesters, and he is our Romanist. He teaches courses on ancient Rome, on ancient world in film, on law and life in ancient Rome, ancient astronomy, have I missed something? And ancient oratory, a new course he is starting in the fall. He gave a talk at the Classical Association of the Middle West and South in St. Louis early this month on literary representations of the death of Marius Gratidianus in the Salem proscriptions. And he's going to give us the faculty talk as you see this afternoon. We're also celebrating that he received a technology grant, so he will be working with VR software on ancient cities, and our students will be using this technology in the classroom, so they will fly over ancient Greece and Rome and hopefully Egypt. So these are big news for us. Elliot, thank you.
Hi everyone. So our next student speaker participant is someone most of you know, Katerina Danches. So Katerina is a junior with a double major in CLAR, Classics and Archaeology, and then also philosophy.
Yes.
So this is slightly different. We don't have a PowerPoint. We're just gonna run through a little skit that we've prepared in relation to my ancient astronomy course, which is ongoing.
Yes, it's the best course this year. Yeah. Recommend taking it.
Yeah, more on that later. Hello, Katerina. As you know, today we are going fishing. It's very important to get out on the water before sunrise. Let me just check my phone. Oh no, the internet is out. I guess there's no way to know when the sun will come up.
Well, there you are wrong, Dr. Pyrus. I happen to know an ancient device called astrolabe. Well, really, I have a working model of an astrolabe made from cardstock and transparency paper. but it accurately tells time and other things about the latitude of Los Angeles, California.
Huh. Astrolabe? What does this word mean?
Well, it means star taker. It's like a sort of clock for the day and for the whole year. It's also the map of the skies.
Wow. How does it work?
Well, it's a bit complicated, but basically it takes the three-dimensional sphere of the whole universe, and of the whole universe, the whole cosmos, and it renders it into this little two-dimensional surface. This rendering is possible because of something called the stereographical projection. Hard word, but.
Fascinating. It dawns on me that we are already fishing. We're already out at sea, and that we actually missed the sunrise. A lot of time has passed. But just to be sure, when did the sun rise today?
First, I'm going to use the back of my astrolabe to see where the sun rose today and where the sun is today along the ecliptic. This ecliptic is a circle that runs through the zodiac signs of the sky. Thank you, Dr. Pires. The sun appears to move along this cycle through the course of the year. The planets also do. Mercury, Venus, Mars, Saturn, Jupiter. That's why ancient people called planets planets. The English words comes from a Greek word that means wanderers. Okay, now let's go to the back of the astrolabe. Let's find, today is April 18th. As you can see, there's all the months of the year here. We have February, March, April, May, June, July. And so we can go to April, and then we have the 30 days of April. We go to April 18th. Okay, there we go. Then you can see that the April is matching with Aries. And so we've got more or less Aries 27th degree. Yeah, the 27th degree of the sign of Aries. So this is where we are today. And now, okay.
Ah, yes, Aries, the ram. But when did the sun come up this morning? And where along the horizon? Can the astrolabe tell us?
Yes, it can. Okay. Now that we have Aries 27th degree, we also have to find Aries here. On the astrolabe, you'll have all the signs of this inner circle of the plastic. Okay, so there we go. Aries, there you go, right before Taurus. Then we have, again, the degrees here. So we go, the ecliptic line, the horizon line. Let's put Aries here, 27th degree. Okay, perfect. So, I have the answers. The sun will come up at about 6:20 today. It rose about 15 degrees north of due east.
Truly, this is a magical device. Now I can believe the old myths. A ram did fly through the air, carrying Phrixus and Hele toward Colchis, the home of Medea, the granddaughter of Helios, the sun god.
Oh, Dr. Pires, you're giving to a hyperbole. It is only the magic of mathematical astronomy.
When will the sun set today? We have caught so many fish already. Perhaps we can build a bonfire on the beach and cook them.
Let me do some more calculations. Okay. So, and there I have it. Okay. According to my calculations, we have just over 13 hours of daylight today. We're past the vernal equinox, but not yet at the height of summer. The sun will set around 7:30 this evening.
Excellent. Let us summon our CLAR friends to the beach and friends from affiliated departments. We can eat fish and gaze at the stars.
Yes, that's a wonderful idea. No longer will we be stuck simply guessing which stars are in the sky. the astrolabe can tell us the location of every bright star in the skies. Here we go, to the plastic. So we can have stars such as Sirius, Rigel, Aldebaran, Deneb-Kaitas, and Ras Al Hay.
Wow.
Wonders to behold.
Tauga edestai, mirabile dictu.
There we go.
So yeah, this is a class, Ancient Astronomy. It's kind of a history of science, but a history of a sort of flawed or outdated science. And in particular, we learned about something called the two-sphere model of the universe. Sphere number 1 is the Earth, and sphere number 2 is a hypothetical sphere where all the major features of the sky, the planets, the stars, move along. And so that's what we've spent most of the term looking at, and we've looked at it in different ways, and eventually we've built this model of the astrolabe. And now as we end the term, we're learning about things that the model doesn't explain, and sort of alternative models that were developed in antiquity, and that eventually takes us into the world of modern astronomy, which is not part of the class. So,
No, but I will say this has been incredibly fun. And actually, even though it doesn't apply to everything, the astrolabe still can tell you a lot of things from the sky today, right?
yeah.
One interesting thing, like on the back, you have like all like the separated days, and so you can find the exact degree that things are at. And I remember one question that I had, it's everything's divided in 30, but no, it's according to the month. So February, there's like 28 days. So it's still very workable. You can always also like use the astrolabe for any latitude in the world, right? You just have to substitute. We have the latitude of Los Angeles. Then we can do like New York if we want. You have to take this apart, but it's not that hard. It's a wonderful class with Dr. Pires. We learned so much about astronomy as well as a little bit of astrology too. We were seeing some myths surrounding the zodiac constellations. And apparently, Dr. Pires is telling me that the zodiac constellations does not correspond to the zodiac like signs that we have, which is really interesting. So I'm technically a Gemini, but the sun is throughout the eclipse on Taurus when I'm born. So I don't know. Take that as your will. Maybe we're all not the zodiac sign that we think, or just doesn't matter that much. But
Yeah, there's been some pretty major changes since antiquity in the way that the sky is laid out with respect to the Earth. So in this class, I don't want to take credit for this model, but basically when I was an undergrad at a different institution, one of my teachers was a very passionate historian of ancient science, and he sort of, as a hobby, but also part of making a textbook, created this you basically just print out these designs on cardstock and plastic transparency, and you can cut them out. So it's very easy to make, easy to get printed, and it works. So it was just a really fun class that I took when I was an undergrad, and sometimes you get an opportunity to pass that on when you get older in life. So thank you, Katarina.
thank you, Dr.
Thank
Pires.
you. We have a lot of questions, and maybe even Katerina can take this and show you around the audience. So, so how about
That's
any
really
questions for Katerina?
Do people want to see the astrolabe?
here,
Oh, you do. No, wait. Oh, I'll take it. It's a good Dr. Pires. There you go.
Yeah, Clara.
Of course.
Was the astrolabe invented after July and August were added to the calendar, or did it used to be different?
Well, so basically, it's a little uncertain when exactly this particular device was invented, but there's other models that we definitely know existed in antiquity, like an armillary sphere is one, and then there's just generally a science of spherics. And the astrolabe seems to have, the science of spherics existed in classical antiquity, and then the principle of stereographic projection, which makes possible doing spherics on a two-dimensional surface, existed, at least in late antiquity. So yes, I mean, it existed after the introduction of July and August. Yeah.
All right, that's perfect. People will see the
Yeah.
astrolabe model then, and
There's a lot of detail, a lot of little. That was, I mean, the hard part is just trying to figure out what all the lines indicate and how they correspond to your perception. And for me, one of the most interesting things about learning about ancient astronomy, I mean, it's hardly a single unified field of study in antiquity. There are variations in the theories, but most of them imply that the Earth is at the center, or they straight up say this, which we now know is not true. But still, a lot of this ancient astronomy is used by modern astronomers just because it's so useful based on the way you perceive the stars and the planets and other things at night. So that's been a lot of the fun. That we meet in the evenings at 6 p.m. We get done about 7:30, 7:20.
Yeah.
And not so much anymore because it's gotten lighter, but at the beginning of the term, we would go down after class and just do some stargazing.
yes,
And it's just fun to, actually use this stuff to.
it is. And at the beginning, we were using mainly stellarum to stargaze, but now we could use the astrolabe, I guess, see what stars are in the sky still works.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, we've kind of left behind, we're getting away from our screens.
Let's go. Yeah.
Wonderful.
So if anyone here is not a senior or a professor, you should definitely take Dr. Pyrus's ancient astronomy.
Or a professor, yeah.
Yeah.
I'd love to. There's so much to know about the stars, and it's just. But I will say, over the summer, if you're still looking for a course and you want to take an online course with me in summer session 1, I am teaching ancient astronomy again. We meet online, but other than that, it's fine.
That'll be fun. Yeah.
If I were to sign up for this class, would it count towards a minor? And how many classes would I take for a minor?
Yes, absolutely. It would count towards your DSTM, I think, core requirements. It counts for core requirement, History of Mathematics and Science core. It counts for a minor in CLAR, one of 4 courses, 2 upper division, 2 lower division, that you would need to take for CLAR minor. And then potentially also CLAR major, if you want to take a CLAR major or add a major. Can you tell us about being a double major?
Well, being a double major is, I would say, not complicated at all at the BCLA school, because the classics major actually doesn't have overwhelming coursework, and classes such as Dr. Pyrus's ancient astronomy actually take some core requirements from the BCLA curriculum, like in general. So it is a very good, it's very good for your general formation in Loyola, but also for your general formation in life. Because you can learn about so many things. We can learn about the sky, about ancient history, how that has been impacting us. We can learn about law and life in ancient Rome, how that still is going through. And in modern life, we learn so many languages. I mean, I've taken a lot of Greek and Latin, which it has been just wonderful for my writing skills, actually. It's been helping me to better understand grammar. So I'd say the classics, or even we read many epics, we read many good books here. It just helps in your formation as a person, as the school says, formation of the whole person. That's what we aim at, and I think the classics major is the best one for it. And again, not too difficult to take, so I would recommend anyone who's thinking about double majoring, do it. You'll not regret it. It's the best major here. Don't tell the philosophy people I said that.
So I will move on. Thank you very much for this presentation. And in classics, part of our creative output is to put together little adaptations of plays and reenactment, as we said, of Rome. So we invite you to, especially the parents, to stay on until Saturday and come and cheer the students who will be performing a play, doing Roman reenactment, followed by olive oil tasting because.
Olive oil tasting before the rum reenactment.
Okay, well, it doesn't matter. Okay. So let me. Sorry. Do you have it? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So as I said today, we will take a moment whenever there is a moment in between talks to introduce ourselves and the faculty and the students. So as I mentioned to you before, I have been here for 25 years. I come from Athens, Greece, and my field is classics mostly. I'm a Hellenist. And so the course which Lily, that I'm going to introduce in a minute, took with me is part of what I do in my academic, creative, and professional life and work, which is inherently interdisciplinary, as it explores the concept of classical Hellenism and its imprint on modern theories of racial and ethnic superiority, and on modern subject formation in Europe, both Greece, Germany, France, England, and other countries that used classical Hellenism as their myth of origins as they created their own sense of national identity. So in my classes, we study the impact and uses of classical antiquity in contemporary theatrical and film cultures. And so in this particular class that is called Classical Hellenism, Race and Ethnicity, we did precisely that. We studied ancient Greek identity from a book that starts at 776 BC, the first Olympic Games, the first pan-Hellenic institution where we have the first sense of Greek identity forming, and we continued until contemporary Greece, and looked at how the idea of Greece has been used in creating the senses of ethnic and national identity, not just for Greece, but for Europe. So I want to introduce Lily. Her major is political science and has a minor in classics and archaeology. She's one of the many seniors we have here today, so she's graduating in a couple of weeks. And the great news, and we'll celebrate that with you here, is that she's been accepted in one of the top universities to study law, the Marquette University, and she's going there very, very soon. So congratulations, Lily. She did this course with me last semester. So when we get all our students to go and revisit a paper they wrote the previous semester, you know that takes a little bit of extra work, especially as they are only a couple of weeks before graduation. So I'm grateful that she put the effort, and I'm happy that she will talk about something that is very dear to her heart, as she was also a soccer player, and what she aims to do is to become a lawyer for sports. So Lily Horn is going to talk to you about 1896, the first revival of the Olympic Games in Athens.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Professor Zaccaria, for inviting me to speak today. It's truly an honor. As Professor Zaccaria mentioned, I played soccer. I played soccer for 17 years of my life, and it was a big part of who I was. Growing up around sports, and also being the only child of two avid sports fans, kind of meant one thing, that sports were always on at our house. So whenever the Olympics rolled around every couple of years, we were basically glued to the TV. We would be watching every event possible, and it kind of just became something that my parents and I loved. It grew to be a tradition, and so the Olympics held a special place in my heart. So last fall, when I took Classic Hellenism with Professor Zaccaria, I kind of knew my term paper would be about the Olympics. So my paper, which I'm here to discuss, focuses on the revival of the Olympic Games in 1896. And more specifically, I focus on how it established Greece as the cradle of Western civilization by connecting the modern Greek state with its classic heritage, which contributed heavily to the ideas that we celebrate when we look at what defines a Western state and Western culture. There we go. So to give a quick overview of my presentation, we'll start by exploring the circumstances leading to the revival of the Olympic Games, including a shift in Greece's national identity and the rise of Philhellenism in Europe. We'll then compare the ancient Olympic Games with the 1896 revival, focusing on the continuity between the two. And finally, we'll discuss how the bridge built during the revival served as a pillar to connect modern Greece with the legacy of its ancestors. This connection puts Greece as the creator of many principles that are practiced in Western civilization, therefore describing Greece, both ancient and modern, as the cradle of Western civilization. After Greece's independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1821, Greeks were searching for a new national identity after nearly 400 years of Ottoman rule. During this time, the rise of nationalism became present throughout Europe, and Greece was no exception. However, unlike the xenophobic tendencies observed in some nationalistic movements, Greece's nationalism was introspective and focused on the internal consolidation of Greek identity that resonated with its historical roots. This led to many Greeks developing a profound appreciation for their history and fostered a sense of pride in their ancestors and what they were able to accomplish. They hoped to create a contemporary version of Hellenism that could stand alongside other interpretations of Greek heritage. But the love of ancient Greece didn't just exist within the country's borders. Throughout Europe in the 18th and 19th century, many fell in love with the culture and philosophy of ancient Greece. After discoveries of ancient sites like the Acropolis in Delphi and Olympia in the 19th century, Philhellenism was rampant. Philhellenes, or lovers of classical Greece, were enamored with Greece's classical heritage and believed that being in Greece would invoke a revival of its ancient legacy. Baron Pierre de Coubertin, I'm not good with French, was a French-born aristocrat and avid Philhellene. He chose to be an intellectual and focus on the physical education in schools. In 1883, he visited the rugby school in England, and he saw the impact of organized sport on the individual and the community, both morally and physically, which was an idea first possessed by the ancient Greeks. After failing to establish physical education in French schools, he was inspired to revive the ancient festival of the Olympics. In ancient Greece, there was a rotation of 4 Panhellenic festivals that were used to unite the Greek city-states and honor the gods, with one festival being celebrated per year. In 1776 BCE, the first ancient Olympic Games was held over the course of 5 days. The games honored Zeus and were held in Olympia. So, bottom here is kind of a mock-up of what Olympia would have looked like at the height of the games. This white building in the center is the Temple of Zeus, which in there stood a 41-foot statue of Zeus, which was kind of renowned to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And ironically, not ironically enough, in his right hand held a statue of Nike, the goddess of victory. The buildings surrounding the temple were places where athletes could train, compete, and live. The games consisted of a number of athletic events like wrestling, chariot races, or running, as agon, or contest, was central to the Greek societal structure. So the 2 photographs to the very right are kind of depictions of what a couple events would have looked like. The top photo shows the chariot races in the stadium, and the bottom is a marble sculpture that shows 2 Olympians competing in a wrestling match. And the victors of these events would be crowned with olive leaves. The festival highlighted a celebration of Greek identity, which marked a shared language and religious practices. Through these events, the Greek city-states were unified and came together, even when they were in conflict with one another. The Olympic truce, which was signed in the 9th century BC, so before the games, ensured safe participation for athletes and spectators. The festival, which occurred every 4 years, was put to an end in 393 CE when Roman Emperor Theodosius I aimed to promote Christianity or pagan rituals. Despite the popularity of the games, its separation from the religious aspect as Greece acquired new cultures, it was first and foremost a pagan festival and unable to continue. So that leads us to 1896. In 1894, Coubertin suggested his idea of an Olympic revival, where he referred constantly to the shared roots of Greece to the Western civilization. He suggested that Athens be the first to hold the games, and then 4 years later, Paris would be the host. Because of the quick turnaround, Athens had to start preparing for the first Olympic Games. The city made an effort to accentuate the Greek heritage through various decorations, including printing stamps showing scenes from antiquity. Efforts were also made to restore previous structures for the games. The most fitting example being the Parthetic Stadium, pictured to the left, right here, was originally built in 330 BCE. Thanks to Georgios Averrof, an Egyptian Greek, the stadium was restored with white marble, and the track inside was intended to replicate the track used in the original festival. The opening ceremony of the 1896 Games were held deliberately on Greek Independence Day, March 25th. Crown Prince Constantine's speech at the opening ceremony highlighted Greece's duty to host the Games as their originator, and his hope that they would bring Greece closer to the civilized world. The ancient heritage was evident in the Games themselves, with officials bearing names used in antiquity and events like discus and stone throw, which were rooted in ancient Greek traditions. The medals awarded, pictured on top, feature Zeus on one side and the Acropolis on the other. And the winners, like the ones from Olympia, would also receive olive branches. The poster used for the official games, pictured on the bottom right, highlights several details defining the connection between ancient Greece and contemporary Greece. The picture is inscribed with 1776 to 1896, establishing continuity, and pictures olive branches, which again were used to crown the victors, and the Acropolis, and a girl personifying Athena. All of these striking the connection between the ancient festival and its revival. The inclusion of the marathon in the modern Olympics also exemplified a blend of ancient heritage and the modern sporting culture. The idea of the marathon, which was inspired by a historic run from Marathon to Athens to announce the victory over the Persians, captured the public's imagination and highlighted the constructed nature of the Olympic revival. Spyros Louis, a Greek runner, would go on to win the marathon, igniting national pride and reinforcing a connection between modern Greeks and their ancestors. The 1896 Olympics in Athens were instrumental in reviving and upholding several ancient Olympic Greek ideals within a modern context. Particularly, the notion of Olympic truce was restored, promoting peace and ensuring that the Games served as a neutral ground where athletes from around the world could compete safely, free from political or military conflict. The game emphasized unity and universalism, which originally celebrated the gathering of Greek city-states, but in 1896, this transformed into a global event welcoming participants from 14 nations and fostering a sense of international camaraderie and cultural exchange. The Games also sought to embody a philanthropia, or the love of humanity, encouraging a spirit of respect and understanding across diverse cultures, echoing the ancient Greek emphasis of kindness and humanity towards all. Through these principles, the first modern Games was truly a philosophical and ethical legacy of its ancient predecessors, promoting the ideals that transcended mere competition to include a broader humanitarian and unifying claims. The Games not only marked a resurrection of a monumental sporting tradition, but also significantly deepened the historical and cultural connection between ancient and modern Greece. The revival successfully celebrated Greece's ancient heritage through symbolic elements and the inclusion of traditionally inspired events, highlighting the timeless relevance of these ancient practices. By intertwining the ancient ideals of peace, unity, and philanthropy, the modern international sportsmanship, the Athens Games reinforced Greece's foundational role in shaping both ancient and contemporary ideals, not just honoring Greece's legacy, but also positioning it as the cradle of Western civilization. The revival also reinforced continuity between ancient Greek ideals and Western civilization, particularly in the realms of philosophy, art, science, and democracy. In the arts, the connection was manifested through the revival of classical aesthetics and the celebration of Greek symbols and architecture. Scientifically, the legacy of ancient Greek inquiry and rationalism continued to inspire modern education and intellectual pursuits, emphasizing a tradition of systemic investigation and critical thinking that is the bedrock of Western science. Politically, the democratic principles first conceived in ancient Athens still resonate in modern governance and public life, underscoring a continuous commitment to civic participation and democratic values. Philosophically, the revival highlighted this enduring relevance of Greek classical values such as excellence and human flourishing, which remain central to modern ethical and philosophical discourse. By bridging these ancient concepts with the identity of contemporary Greece, the Olympic revival acted as a catalyst for re-engaging and promoting these foundational pillars of Western civilization. In Western civilization today, we see how intertwined these classical Greek ideals are, even in our own society. For example, the Lincoln Monument in Washington, D.C. intertwines Greek art, politics, and philosophy. It was inspired heavily by the Parthenon in Athens, as you can see here. The top photo being the Lincoln Memorial and the bottom being Parthenon, very similar architecturally. But the memorial wasn't just based off the Parthenon for aesthetic purposes. Parthenon's a beautiful building, but the designer Henry Bacon felt that since Lincoln defined democracy in the United States, his memorial should be based off of the birthplace of it. And while Lincoln was not a founding father, he led a country's constitution, took inspiration from some of the ideas of Plato's Republic, showcasing the connection between Greek philosophy and the United States government. The 1896 revival significantly enhanced the global perception of Greece, reaffirming its historical and cultural significance. Before the revival, Greece was often perceived primarily through the lens of its ancient ruins and classical studies, somewhat detached from the modern world. However, the modern Olympics in 1896 showcased Greece as a vibrant source of enduring values and ideals, actively engaging with its classical roots. This not only rejuvenated international interest in Greek culture, but also reshaped its image from a distant historical relic to a dynamic originator in principles that continue to influence modern societies. Additionally, the successful organization of the Games demonstrated Greece's capabilities on a logical and cultural level, aligning it closely with the leading nations of Europe. As a result, Greece was not just seen as a keeper of ancient legacies, but as an active, modern participant in European affairs. This shift deepened the appreciation for Greece's ancestral heritage and highlighted its ongoing legacy and relevance, firmly establishing it as the cradle of Western civilization. This event acted as a bridge which connected the rich history and the achievements of ancient Greece with the aspirations and identity of a modern Greek state. It also demonstrated the uninterrupted continuity of Greek culture and its lasting impact on Western values. The revival underscored the idea that contemporary Greece was not just a geographical entity, but a living reception of ancient Greek values and wisdom, ready to contribute to Western civilization with the same spirit and innovation that characterized its ancestors whose ideals helped found it.
Okay, so questions for Lily. Well done, Lily. Lily is a classics and archaeology minor, if I forgot to say that. That's obvious here. Any questions for Lily?
Yeah, I was wondering if the coming back of the Olympic Games not only like brought back the Olympic Games in itself, but it also like had started other like worldwide competitions of sports like the World Cup or for soccer or even like competitions for volley or something like that.
I don't know the full extent of how that started, but I think, the Olympics obviously were a great model for, implementing the international competitions we see all over the world in various sports. So, I think definitely a lot of things took inspiration. And I didn't mention this in my presentation, but prior to the games being started in 1896, there were other versions of the Olympics that were started. Greece had a couple that never just took off. Sweden had a couple ones, but they never really grew traction like the ones like how we see today. Yeah.
This might be a little bit too specific, so feel free to just not answer. But back in ancient times, women weren't allowed to compete or attend the games. I was wondering if you know anything about kind of the evolution of like the modern iteration and the inclusion of women in that.
I don't know that to be specific, but yeah, you are right that women couldn't compete in ancient games. There's one woman who was able to be I think she was a trainer for a boxer, and her boxer actually won. And while she was celebrating, she kind of got her identity be like, oh, that's a woman, why is she here? So that, but I don't know the full inclusion of it, I would imagine,
Well, there were also training and competing naked,
Yes.
which that was in antiquity. So, certain things changed in the contemporary world, right?
Yeah, put clothes on.
All right. Thank you very much, Haley. That was great. Catch up with time a little bit. Let's move on. And Caroline will, Sauvage, my colleague, who is a professor of ancient and Mediterranean studies, will introduce Max, right? Yes. And she is responsible for all the capstone presentations, so she will be introducing all 3 students who are graduating. So Caroline, you want to come?
Good morning. I'm Professor Sauvage. I'm responsible for the archaeology and especially Near Eastern archaeology in the department, and I'm delighted to introduce the caption presentation. We will have 3 today that were done by our graduating majors, whom we will miss dearly. So their work was part of an upper division seminar on the late Bronze Age city of Ugarit, which is in modern-day Syria, that I was teaching in the fall. This seminar also developed as a caption, seminar, and it allowed students to deeply engage in the material culture, the question of cultural heritage, and learn about creating an exhibit for the object that they studied. They had to dig deeper into their knowledge and in the archaeology of the site, literally, to mindfully research their subject and create, in the end, a lovely exhibit that is still on display at the library on the 3rd floor, just in front of special collection. If you have not seen it yet, I encourage you to see it. It is truly lovely. To see the material from this site, you will have to go either to the Louvre Museum in Paris, which I also encourage you to do, or to Syria, especially Damascus and Latakia, which you cannot access right now. So it is really your one chance to see this lovely, exceptional material. So they were really lucky to work on this material. I would like to take all the credit for their research and the quality of their research that you will hear in a few minutes, but really I can't, because it only reflects how brilliant, engaged, and mindful they are, and they have been for the past 4 years. And also I have to express how proud I am and humbled by all of what they achieved and how much they grew in and progressed in the past 4 years. So, with that said, with no tears, I would like to introduce Max to talk about his research subject on royal ideology and iconography in Ugarit. Thank you.
Well, hello everybody. Thank you for the introduction. As Professor Sauvage said, my name is Max Nicholas, and I'm a senior classics and archaeology major. And I'm very excited to have the opportunity to share what I've been working on with you. So throughout this course and for the past semester, I have been working on royal ideology and iconography in Ugarit, with a particular focus on the use of violent imagery in these depictions. So what do I mean by ideology? I take a moment to explain this term, as it is actually an extremely loaded word that has undergone several transformations and has been given new definitions from the modern period. And there are several difficulties applying this modern term of Western origin to an ancient civilization. For my research, I attempt to remove all the negative connotations and other modern aspects of the word in order to focus purely on the practical implementation of a particular belief in a society. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy offers a definition that I find useful as a model for studying ideology in Ugarit. Christine Sipnowich argues that, quote, an ideology exists to confirm a certain political viewpoint, serve the interests of certain people, or to perform a functional role in relation to social, economic, political, and legal institutions. Although this definition is a postmodernist view of the word, it still provides a valuable way to view how ideology was used in relation to other institutions in Ugarit. Scholars Hill, Jones, and Morales offer a definition of the political model in ancient civilizations that succinctly argues how the office was viewed. They demonstrate that ancient societies held the view that, quote, the concept of ultimate legitimate authority being invested in the sacred office of kingship. These two definitions I have given are a useful framework for studying the perception of royal authority in Euclid, and they can act as a reference point for how the king functioned in the society and how people viewed his power. However, these frameworks have not been applied to kingship in Euclid. The definition I gave of ideology has implementations that obviously do not apply to this site, and the view of Hill, Jones, and Morales was a definition for Egyptian and Mesopotamian kings. I plan to use these models and apply them to the Levantine society of Euclid in order to study how ideology was viewed and what beliefs were held in the political infrastructure of Euclid. So where does the iconographical aspect of this study come in? Iconography allows those represented to display certain ideas, depicting how they wish to be viewed. The use of symbols and icons in artistic representations results in the combination by the viewer of the person represented with the icons. People use symbols in their portraits to associate themselves with ideas, and this displays what attributes they want the people to think they have. Iconography can be a way to produce propaganda, which is another loaded word, but when referring to this word, I do not include the negative associations that the modern word has. As scholars Pertuese and Palladini defined it, propaganda is simply the promotion of particular ideas. In an ancient context, iconography was a way for a ruler to depict this propaganda. The ruler included different symbols and icons to remind those of his nature and to create an association with the ideas represented by the symbols. For this project, we were able to use the iconography of kings in Euclid to reconstruct what beliefs were held and what the ideology of the king was. Now that we understand how the aspects of ideology and iconography frame this research, I'd like to share the questions that guided my inquiry. These broad questions are simply starting point for my research and identify large overall themes that I wanted to attempt to answer. The questions all share a connection, which can be basically boiled down to, what did power look like in Euclid, and what can this tell us about ideology in the site? Hopefully, throughout this presentation, I will have answered these questions. Thanks to the extensive written record found at Euclid, we were able to know a great deal about the political makeup of the site. Documents attest to the high level of government, that is, kingly, participation in many aspects of life. Living in a nearly 7,000 square meter palace with restricted access to the public, the king enjoyed a high status. In the seemingly stratified society of Euclid, the king was at the top. It is worth mentioning that king was not simply a title. The king had major administrative roles in the site, as numerous archives have been found at the palace, depicting the complex bureaucracy that he oversaw. The king also had major diplomatic purposes, being the head of international correspondence for the site. In addition, it has even been suggested that maritime trade, the major economic activity and source of wealth and prestige for Euclid, operated through the royal palace. Finally, the king was the head of the Ugaritic religion, as a private temple in the royal palace depicts his religious obligations. With these duties in mind, we were able to look at images of this king. As I mentioned, the aspect of ideology and iconography that I focus on is the use of violent imagery in royal depictions. One example that allows us to view this violent imagery is this representation of the king found in Euclid. This depiction is carved ivory that was originally part of furniture found at the royal palace of Euclid. The panel has 6 plaques carved to represent the king in several different activities. The plaques that I will be focusing on are these ones. For simplicity, I will refer to them as plaques 3 and 5. In plaque 3, we see what is presumably the king of Euclid standing before a kneeled man. The king clutches the hair of the enemy and holds a sword to his face, in a pose that it clearly expresses the subordination of the man by the king. In plaque 5, there's a more odd representation, with a man shown holding 2 objects. While the lion cub is a fun and interesting addition, the mace is the object that I will be focusing on. The mace that is represented in plaque 5 has actual equivalents that have been excavated from Euclid. Several mace heads have been found at the site, including the one pictured here, that is currently displayed in the Ancient Syria exhibit on the 3rd floor of the Hannon Library. This mace head is on loan from the Claremont collection, and is a physical representation of the representations of maces found on the ivory bedpan relief from Euclid. The mace heads that have been excavated from Euclid, such as the limestone one depicted here, support the notion that this object was used in reality by the king. The mace was not simply a symbol represented in art, but was a physical object that was interacted with and experienced in Euclid. So, what was the function of this mace, and why did the king use it? To answer this question, and the question of why the king is represented the way he is in the royal panel reliefs, we must first look at Egypt. Prior to and including the period that corresponds to the late Bronze Age in Euclid, Egyptian art is filled with representations of maces. Maces were also sometimes the actual medium for artistic depictions, as mace heads such as these, found in Egypt, represent Egyptian and identify Egyptian kings. While, like I said, Egyptian art is filled with maces, there are a few depictions I would like to look at in particular. The first is this relief from the Temple of Karnak in Egypt that shows the Egyptian pharaoh Seti I with a mace. Flanking the entrance to the temple, these reliefs depict the Egyptian king symbolically destroying the several enemies that are depicted as men kneeling in front of him. The weapon that the king uses to annihilate his enemies is a mace. The use of this weapon, with the inclusion of the composition of a striding man with that one hand raised with a mace and the other hand clutching the hair of a kneeling enemy, is known as the smiting pose. The smiting pose becomes the basic composition to represent a king defeating his enemies, his military successes in Egyptian art. The origins of the smiting pose can be traced to this object here, the Narmer palette. While the Narmer palette is filled with iconography, I will look at the main subject of the palette. As you can see, the composition of the subject is extremely similar to the image of Seti I that I showed earlier. The Egyptian king Narmer is depicted with a mace in a raised hand, while he clutches the hair of an enemy in front of him. Maces may have originally been used practically in battle by the Egyptians, but as technological advances in weaponry supplied armies with more effective means of fighting, the mace transitioned to a purely symbolic role. The inclusion of the mace and the stance of the king transcend the simple recording of a military victory and come to represent the actual authority of the king. The smiting pose was the basic and common way to identify the power of the pharaoh and the pharaoh himself. It expressed ideas of violence and authority that were inherent to the rule to anyone who viewed it. The scene always contained the same aspects, and it would immediately identify the pharaoh and what was occurring to its viewers. Egyptologist Laurel Bostock offers a succinct definition of the scene, as she says, quote, "The icon is defined by a combination of consistent elements: the king, his posture, a mace, and the captives." Laurel Bostock offers many useful ways to view violent imagery in her work, Violence and Power in Ancient Egypt, which was very helpful to my research and will be quoted several times in my next few points. As she argues, violence was inherent to representations of Egyptian kings. The inclusion of this violence in depictions of pharaohs reminded the audience why exactly he was in power. It expressed to the audience that the pharaoh was an all-powerful being who could use violence against those who went against his orders. Bostock argues that the use of violent imagery expresses the worldview of the pharaoh. The pharaoh saw himself as having ultimate authority in Egypt and demonstrated this to his subjects through his representations. Bostock makes another point that is worth mentioning here. Since we are looking at representations of ancient art, we do not react with the fear that they were intended to impose. We see these more as representations in art, not as an expression of annihilation that was meant to invoke fear from the viewer. However, if we attempt to remove the separation between us and these representations, we may be able to see more clearly the brutality, awesomeness, and horror that they intended to inspire. During the Late Bronze Age, Egypt played a major role in international happenings. Due to northern campaigns by Egyptian pharaohs during the New Kingdom, Egypt extended its influence to the Levant. Archaeological evidence from Ugarit establishes an interaction between the site and Egypt in the Middle Bronze Age. Ugarit is also attested to in the Amarna letters, a collection of 14th century Akkadian letters found in Egypt. The archaeological evidence and written documents demonstrate the connection between Egypt and Ugarit and the great influence that Egypt imparted on the Levant. Although Egypt did not directly rule Ugarit, Egypt and Ugarit still had close diplomatic relations, with much political and cultural interaction occurring. After 1350 BCE, Ugarit fell under Hittite dominion. The Hittites, a powerful group located to the north in modern-day Turkey, extended to the south and made Ugarit a vassal state. However, Egyptian influence did not disappear. The two sides stayed connected, and Egypt remained very active in the area. The expansion into the Levant by Egypt explains how their royal representations were inherited by Ugarit. The influence in the Levant held by Egypt allowed for their ideological views and stylistic representations to be transmitted to Ugarit. After looking at examples of Egyptian royal representations and understanding the political power of Egypt in the region, the connection between the Egyptian depictions and the depictions from Ugarit are clear and obvious, which we will now return to. The smiting pose and the iconography of the Egyptian kings clearly acted as a model for Ugaritic kings. The Ugaritic kings used the scene as a framework to express their ideology and depict their propaganda to those who viewed them. However, there is a major difference between the extent to which this composition was applied. I suggest that Levantine societies, as demonstrated by Ugarit, applied the smiting pose to divine subjects, unlike their Egyptian equivalents. Egyptian examples of the smiting pose were limited strictly to representations of the mortal pharaoh. The few depictions from Egypt that do depict a divine subject in this pose date to the Ptolemaic period, long after the destruction of Ugarit. For example, this is the stele of Baal with thunderbolt, currently housed in the Louvre Museum, excavated from Ugarit. This stele represents the king of the gods Baal, with a mace being held in a raised arm. The god is clearly in the smiting pose, as you can see the many similarities between this and the Egyptian representations we've looked at. In addition to the stele representing Baal with a mace, several figurines have been found at Ugarit that show connection to the Egyptian representations of kings. The Louvre Museum currently has 14 bronze figurines from Ugarit in its collection, with 9 of these figurines appearing to be in the smiting pose. The objects that the figurines held are once held or lost, making it impossible to definitively argue that these figurines represent the scene. And in addition, the sample size is extremely limited, as these only include figurines from the Louvre, not all figurines excavated from Ugarit. However, if the figurines do in fact represent Baal in the smiting pose, they support this notion that Ugarit applied this iconography to divine subjects, unlike Egypt. But whether or not those figurines depict Baal in the smiting pose, the stele of Baal with thunderbolt is undeniable evidence that Ugarit applied this composition to representations of divine subjects. Ugarit inherited this framework, but extended it to its deities, and placed it in a new way that artistic representation had not been used before. After viewing how the king was viewed in Ugarit and what the influence was on these representations, we were able to return to the topic of royal ideology. Specifically, we were able to return to the question of what royal ideology the king had and what he was attempting to convey to his audience. Through images of the king with the mace and in the pose of subjugating enemies, the king of Ugarit associates himself with the authority believed to be held by the pharaoh. The Ugaritic king uses an established iconography to represent himself as an established power. As I mentioned, Egypt was able to conquer many areas in the Levant and influence several regions, an aspect of Egypt that the Ugaritic king attempted to emulate. Although Ugarit was officially under Hittite dominion after 1350 BCE, the influence of Egypt in the Levant would still have been at the front of the psyche of the people. The king of Ugarit attempted to emulate this power expressed by Egypt, using their own iconography and symbols to represent his authority. In addition to associating the king with Egypt, the use of a mace in the composition of dominance over another person allowed the king of Ugarit to remind those viewing why they should obey him. The wielding by the king of an inherently violent object reminded his subjects that he had the ability to enact force on anyone who disobeyed him. The king expressed the succinct message that he could annihilate his enemies, whether perceived or in reality, with the object that represented his power. If anyone were to question why they should obey the king, the mace was sure to remind them. A useful example of the functionality of the mace as a symbol of power is depicted in the Iliad, where during a council, Odysseus strikes an insubordinate character with a scepter. Although this is a Greek story written several hundred years after the destruction of Ugarit, it still provides a useful example of the practicality of objects that represent power. The point I mentioned earlier argued by Bostock is worth applying to the reconstruction of royal ideology here in Ugarit. Bostock argued, as I said, that we have a hard time appreciating the fear that is expressed in this ancient art. Since we view these as art, we do not have the reaction of fear. However, the image of a king with a weapon that is able to annihilate enemies, or clutching the hair of a kneeling man, would be sure to truly evoke fear from anyone who viewed it. If we place the scene in a modern context, with a modern ruler holding a weapon to an enemy, we may appreciate the horror that they attempt to inspire a bit more. Perhaps the Ugaritic king even predicted the influential Weberian definition of a state, and used icons to express that he held a monopoly of physical force in Ugarit. The iconography of the king of Ugarit reminded his subjects that the source of his power was this physical force, and that he was able and willing to enact this on anyone who went against his orders. Finally, the extension of the mace and the smiting pose to the gods associated the king with the deities that were worshipped in Ugarit. The king was mirroring the god Baal and expressing the divine favor towards his power. The king was represented in the same composition with the same object that the king of the gods had. Not only was Baal a major deity worshipped in Ugarit, he was even associated with the king. A passage from a poem known as the Baal Cycle represents Baal being elected as king of the gods, demonstrating this close connection between the god and the office. The three aspects of royal ideology that I've mentioned, being the association with Egypt, the reminder of the physical force held by the king, and the association with the gods, expresses how power was viewed in Ugarit and what the worldview of the king was. From the iconography represented in images of the king, we were able to reconstruct this ideology and attempt to learn what the message is that the king was expressing to his subjects. The power dynamics and propaganda demonstrated in representations of the king depict that the king viewed himself as having ultimate authority in Ugarit and used several aspects to covertly and overtly express that he was a person who should be obeyed. As I near the end of my presentation, I would like to offer some additional avenues that can extend from this topic. These are not proven arguments, but merely my own observations that could expand from the study. Hittite representations, such as these, may represent the smiting pose. These representations, dating to the 10th century BC and 750 BC, show Hittite deities wielding a weapon in a raised arm, demonstrating obvious similarities to the smiting pose from Egypt. Although poorly preserved, the representations show these deities in a similar stylistic way to the Egyptian and Ugaritic representations that we have looked at. I suggest that this composition was transmitted from Egypt, with the Levant acting as a conduit to Hittite art. The interactions between Egypt and the Hittites in the Levant may have exposed the Hittites to this iconography. The style was firmly established in Ugarit, which may have made the expansion of this artistic representation to the north possible. But as I mentioned, this is merely an observation that would require a further study to confirm. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all my professors who have been so helpful to me and impactful throughout my time here. I'd like to give a special thank you to Dr. Zakaria, who's opened me to countless opportunities, to, of course, Dr. Savage, who introduced me to this beautiful site, guided me through my research, and who without this project would have been impossible. Finally, I would like to thank all of you for listening, and if there are any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer. Thank you.
Wonderful job there. Do we have any questions for Max? Yes.
Dr.
Chris.
Gibson.
Good job.
Thank you.
I'm curious about plaque number 3.
Yes.
Is it significant that there's a sword and not a mace being used there?
That is a very interesting observation because they kind of split it up. They split up this pose where one clearly has the striding composition but not the object, but the other one has the object but not the composition. So it might just be a regional variation, stylistic difference. Objects like this sword have been excavated from the Levant, but other than that, I do not know why exactly they did not choose to use a mace. Dr. Savage.
You can make a parallel here between these two presentations and the steady bar, because on the steady bar also has a dagger or a sword on his belt. Yeah, right there. So then you get the king, it's a split representation where you get both the dagger in action and then the mace.
Pretend I said that. Yes.
Can you go back to 3 and 5?
Yes.
I actually wanted to ask you if you have any thoughts about the costumery, so the dress, right? Because on 3, have you looked into the differences in dress and what this might mean? They're very different, and
they are. The only thing I can tell you is I do know the king often was depicted in religious garments to associate himself with the king. So if we look at Stele Ball, this figure right here is supposed to be the king in religious garments. And as I said, one of his major roles was religion. So one of these might be depicting a outfit you would wear on a military campaign, demonstrating more of his physical brutality and violence. The other, again, the lion cub is an interesting addition, but it may be more of a religious ritual garment.
Yeah, we can keep on moving. So also what we can say is that these presentations are actually graded presentations. They're part of their capstone requirement. And so you just saw a young scholar in the making. So well done. Yes. And there is a small difference between the capstone presentations. You'll realize that they're a little longer because that's how we've organized it. The other presentations are about 10 minutes with Q&A, whereas the actual capstone presentations are 20 minutes plus Q&A. So if you see them lasting longer, that's the reason. So right now, it's my pleasure to introduce Luisa Ortega. She's one of our other seniors in the room, which means she's graduating in a couple of weeks with a major in theater. When people get up and go, it's because they're in classes. Luisa just finished the class and came here running from the other side of campus. So she's a theater studies major, and she's putting her own performance, that's their capstone for theater studies, this week or next week, is it?
Next week.
Next
yes.
week, yes. So she's written the work that she can tell us something about at the very end, but what she's here to present is a paper that she wrote for my class, the same class that Lily was in, the Classical Hellenism, Race and Ethnicity last semester. And she's going to talk to you about heritage and conflict, modern identity, and the universality of classical Greece. So that will follow nicely from the earlier presentation we had. So Luisa, come along.
All right, thank you so much for having me. I'm very grateful to be speaking today. I'll be presenting on my final essay for the class Classical Hellenism, Race and Ethnicity, and it's titled Heritage and Conflict, Modern Identity and the Universality of Classical Greece. So in this text, I examine the relationship between Greece's ancient heritage and its modern identity by discussing the complexities of cultural property, material history, and the global recognition of Greek antiquities. I focus on things like the Parthenon marbles as a symbol of the interplay between these, and I also delve into the tension between Greece's universally acclaimed past and the quest that has been taken by Greeks in modernity to assert ownership and connection to their own cultural roots. My thesis throughout this project was the following. While being considered the cradle of Western civilization is a source of pride for many Greeks today, this notion has also created the idea that Greece's history and culture is universal property. This has created a search within modern Greek identity for a space that upholds Greece's universal fame, while also ensuring that Greek things can remain Greek. So when we think of Greece, it's not unusual to find our minds going to the classical and Hellenistic ages, where a lot of knowledge, culture, and tradition that we recognize in the Western world today found its origins. So images of the Acropolis and the Parthenon might come to mind, as well as thoughts of performers in masks walking across an arena stage reciting words in a comedy or a tragedy. Maybe the words of an ancient Greek philosopher might come to one's head as well. So it's undeniable that Greek history holds the origin of many parts of our contemporary world, which has led many to call Greece the cradle of Western society. The question then becomes how Greeks fit into this idea and how they might manage to balance it with their own identity today in modernity. I'm going to be looking a little bit into the approaches and arguments I took, beginning with nationalism. So nationalism and archaeology connect in many ways, but especially in the way that people relate to the material past of their nation and build it into their identity. One of the common arguments in the literature on nationalism is, in the past, is the assumption that nationalist abuses of the archaeological past take place primarily under authoritarianism and dictatorial regimes, and are almost always interventions. However, this can be countered by stating that nationalism is an ontology that involves all members of a nationalized body, and one which relates to the material past in more subtle ways than is normally thought. So nationalism involves a shared social memory of the past, as well as a shared dream that often ties the past to the present and future, And a clear example of this in contemporary Greek history can be seen in a dispute that occurred between Greece and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia in the 1990s. So following the breakup of Yugoslavia, the small country on the northern border of Greece began to signify a bit of a threat to it, especially to the Greek province that bared the same name. The name Macedonia insinuated the possibility of an expansionist campaign from Fyrom, and the Greek national narrative suggested the argument that Macedonia had always been Greek, and thus naming the Yugoslav state after it constitutes a theft of national property, heritage, and identity. This dispute was further intensified by the discoveries of the archaeologist Manolis Andronicus, through this dispute, he obtained a fundamental role in Greek society. His findings throughout the 20th century, including what is believed to be the tomb of Philip II of Macedonia, became national icons in both Greece and the Yugoslav Republic, and they allowed for the material incorporation of northern Greece into the imaginary topos of Hellenism. So today, UNESCO has named this, the Megalitumba, a World Heritage Site, making it one of only a few that can be found in Greece. And it's visited by approximately 300,000 people every year, either for tourism or for research. So it has become not simply a concrete material reality, but a national monument which merges the memory and legacy of Andronicus, the national commemoration of Philip II and Alexander, and also the need for self-reaffirmation of a region. So in this case, Greek Macedonia or Northern Greece. Although monumentalization requires the past to be rewritten and sort of sanitized in many ways, this tomb is a clear representation of Greece's relationship to its material past, especially through its monumentalization, and how it forges a national identity that allows Greeks to take ownership of it. One of the objects found within the tomb, for example, was the golden sun, which has become a national icon known as the Regina Star. You can see it right there on the top of the box. In August 1992, this symbol was also adopted in the national flag of Macedonia, resulting in an intensification of the dispute that I was previously talking about. So this shows how objects, icons, and figures compose an essential part of modern Greek identity because they're a physical representation of a shared dream of the past. And this emphasizes the fact that the interwovenness of nationalism and archaeology are not always connected to authoritarianism and dictatorships. The connection between the two can be forged through a collective dream of the past and the way that materials play a part in that. Just expanding on this concept of cultural property and material history, something that I dived into in my text was this concept of nostos, or nostalgia. So the connection to the material past is relevant within Greek identity, and it's also connected to a sense of nostalgia, or a desire to reconnect to the past through a quest for its wholeness. So in order to fully claim something as one's own, it's important to consider its wholeness, both in the sense of how much of it physically exists, and in the sense of how much of it one can claim as one's own. So when it comes to Greek identity, especially in relation to the past, it can be said that several parts of it have been scattered and are difficult to trace in the present. And this is due in part to the universal quality that has been given to Greece's past, and the fact that the material past has been challenging for Greeks to claim as their own due to this quality. And a very vivid and well-known example of this is the Parthenon, which is likely the most important part of the material past for Greece because of everything it represents historically. And it's also a direct connection to Greece's classical past, but it's also become a universal symbol for the cradle of civilization in the Western world. And I'll be looking even deeper into that with this case study, which is Lord Elgin's marbles, which I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with. So the quest for wholeness and repatriation in Greek identity spurs in some ways from the effects of colonialism, and the fact that local communities who face colonialism become very cynical to the concept of a world heritage, which is something that's often used to justify foreign patronage over their artifacts being taken and displayed in museums that are not their own. Although Greece has never technically been colonized, it has faced direct foreign government interference, which has had a powerful impact on artifacts and material culture. And this interference, of course, adds to the lack of wholeness felt within modern Greek identity, and to the notion that Greek material culture cannot fully be considered Greek until it's made whole. So meanwhile, the Acropolis Museum currently holds casts of the marbles, and many would say that this stands as a perfect metaphor of the desire to re-territorialize Hellenism and make it whole. The Acropolis Museum provides a home for the Parthenon marbles, reinforcing the claim that they belong to Greece, even if they do not arrive there. In a way, they are noted through their absence, and since the materials have been somewhat divided between Greece and Britain after the original excavations were made in Lord Elgin's expedition, both the British Museum and the Acropolis Museum currently hold casts. However, the significance of these casts are very different in each country because of what they mean. So objects cease to be simply matter when they are equated to history, as can be seen in this example and the ones that I previously explored. And this unveils a world of relationships and connections that people can have with them. And these connections can be put into conflict in several ways when the global significance of an object is different to the local significance that it holds, as is the case with the Parthenon. Its global significance has made it somewhat of a universal claim, and Greeks today are faced with the great challenge of upholding its global fame while also having it remain a local claim. And the return of the marbles would have different consequences globally and locally. Although locally, they would help complete the Greeks' dream of wholeness and would allow them to claim the Parthenon fully as a part of their identity, globally their return would imply different things. There would have to be a sort of reevaluation of who owns the material past and where it belongs, which also connects to the reterritorialism of the past. There are other aspects of Greek history and culture that have set it as the Western canon or the cradle of civilization as we know it, including democracy, literature, performance, and philosophy. Greece has, however, been excluded in many ways from its own narrative and has struggled to obtain the homecoming of its own culture. Just to finish up, these are the main sources that I used to write my paper. They're not all of them, but thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Dr. Zakaria, for having me.
Wonderful job there, Luisa. I hope that you have some questions for Luisa. Do you? No.
A naive question. I'm really interested in what you're saying about Northern Macedonia.
Yes.
Can you talk more about
Go
that?
back and show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so these images I have here, I didn't mention them before, but the flag that's here at the bottom, that's the flag of Macedonia, and that is the like the original box that was found in Philip II's grave. And I just think it's a very interesting dispute because Macedonia, I guess at that time, was a country that was really just coming into its independence and becoming a country, literally. So I think anytime a nation is coming into itself, it needs things to claim. It needs symbols and objects and material culture. So I understand the dispute that that Greeks maybe felt like objects and symbols were being taken from them, but I also understand the fact that a country in its northern border would also feel the need to have those symbols and that material culture incorporated into itself.
And just for history, in the 1990s, this broke out, and the country was called Fyrom, Fyrom, former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. Sounds like formerly known as Prince. Yeah. So that was it, and it only was recognized with its name, Republic of Macedonia, in 2015 with the first left-wing government in Greece. It was really controversial. So what I think Luisa has done very well by bringing this to comparisons is how material culture is being used and recycled, but with different signification for the ancient world and the contemporary world and the actual players of these symbols. So well done,
Thank you.
Luisa. So Caroline, you can again, I think, come in. As we said, this is Greek time, so if we run a couple of minutes late, it's okay. So.
Again, good morning. I have a whole class coming in at 11:50, so I don't know if we should wait for a few minutes before we start.
Sure, we can. If we have time, yes, we can take questions. Yeah, we can wait a little, right? How about you talk about your work? So let's fill in a little bit. I mean, I'm sorry, but that's what we need to do. Yeah.
Yes. Hello again. So, Dr. Sauvage, I'm professor of archaeology, especially Near Eastern archaeology, in I'm also the NEH chair of Mediterranean Studies at LMU and the director of the Archaeology Center and Museum. What I try to do at LMU is working with students, especially in the museum, but also on their research and capstone, to make them learn and love and appreciate every tiny little piece of pottery, even the ones that are ugly and falling apart. We try to catalog, document, and inventory everything that we have in the museum. We will still be doing that in 10 years from now, maybe even 15. But it gives room for a lot of fun in the museum and meaningful student-teacher interactions. My own work is or has been dealing with international interactions, maritime trade, and textile productions. I have been working at the site of ancient Ugarit for many years before the civil war in Syria. I have also published on the site, and I'm a little bit obsessed with the material from the specific city, just because it is fantastic and it can tell us so much about both the ancient world but also the modern world, because as you all know, the Near East is the cradle of civilization. That's where we have the first cities, the first temples, the first communal work in the invention of writing, the invention of astronomy, also in Babylon. Everything originated in the Near East, almost. And Ugarit is exceptional because we have one of the first alphabets, but also because we have religious texts that Clara is going to talk about, with very important deities that are then mentioned in the Bible, with one of the first resurrections from Baal. And because of that, when the site was discovered in 1929 and then excavated during the 30s, and when the alphabetic script Ugaritic was finally deciphered and understood, Western scholars saw all of these names that were so familiar to them in the Bible, and they were like, ha, we have all of these connections, and it all came from the Levant, and we can make all of this previous connection that we didn't know existed, and we can really understand some of the origin of the biblical text through what was found in Ugarit and through their habits of celebrating the gods and communicating with them. I'm not going to spoil your talk, so I'm trying to carefully choose my words so that I'm not using your keywords. Oh, I still have 5 minutes to go.
How about, do you want to introduce Andy?
Sure.
Just that's something he sent me, so yeah.
Oh, there's no CV. Okay, so Andy, Dr. Hogan, is an Egyptologist. He's also a Hellenist, so he works on the first millennium BC in Egypt, especially in economy. It's all out of my memory, so obviously he's not here, so everyone will forgive me if I miss something. And he's been mostly working on ancient economy and trade, especially in the Ptolemaic world. And he's been also working with early, well, we still call it early money and exchanges at the time. We're very lucky to have him here because he's been teaching everything Egyptology for us, Egyptian religions, Egyptian art and archaeology, ancient Nubia, and hieroglyphics. And I know that some of you in the room have taken hieroglyphics, and it's a lot of fun. Now, I would recommend taking an ancient language if you're still looking for a class for next semester. We will also be offering an introduction to Near Eastern languages next semester, which will include a little bit of hieroglyphics and a little bit of Ugaritic and a little bit of everything, so that you can learn about what happened in the Near East with like funny scripts, less funny scripts, and you will do a lot of hands-on work with Dr. Fessler, who's right here. going back to ND and Dr. Hogan, he, of course, holds a PhD in Egyptology and has been working in different places, including NYU and ISO, the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, and also Berkeley at the museum there, at the Teptunis Center, where I was also studying papyrus related to ancient economy and ancient trade. He's a very active scholar, and most recently he's been giving some talks at the Gaining Villa last fall, of course at LMU in the Classics and Archaeology department, and only last weekend at Stanford University, again on ancient trade. So his talk last weekend was entitled Farming the Fayum and Bidding at Bedet, a new understanding of the implementation and mutation of Ptolemaic fiscal institution within the Ptolemaic economy. For those of you who don't know, Stanford is one of the major centers for the study of ancient economy, especially Ptolemaic ones. Hey, I'm on time. So,
yes, good. What do you think, Claire? It's Claire.
Yeah, I think we should start with Clara, and we can do like the other presentations and introduction of faculty in between. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Clara and her capstone research project. She's been working so hard for the past 4 years. She is a double major in biochemistry and classics and archaeology. And although for some of you it might sound weird to have these two majors, Clara has found a way to make it all work together, and she is so driven that she has secured herself a fantastic internship starting July, as in a conservation firm. So she will continue with classics and archaeology and biochemistry and work on fantastic objects and bring them back to life so that they can continue to tell us so many things about the past for a very, very long time. So her capstone project was on religion and community at UGarrett, which is the perfect subject for my class on Near Eastern religions. So thank you so much. I'm looking forward to it.
So hello everyone. I am so excited to get to talk to you guys about this today. So my topic, as Dr. Savage already introduced, is religion and community in UGarrett. And so I have a few sections that I'll go through to really give you the basics, introduce you to the pantheon, to the structure of the religion, and talk about what it all means. So first I want to introduce you to the site of UGarrett. It is on the coast of what is now modern Syria, and it was occupied continuously from 6500 BCE to 1200 BCE. When it was razed and abandoned during the Late Bronze Age. It had amicable relationships with a lot of the ancient world, a lot of the surrounding civilizations. They had thriving trade and communications relationships with Egypt and Cyprus and many other places surrounding them. And they also had their own written language, one of the first alphabetic languages, Ugaritic, and they had their own distinct religious traditions separate from their surrounding civilizations. But I also want to introduce you to a much more specific concept of Beitu. Beitu is the Ugaritic word for family or community. It's used interchangeably. It's used to describe a group of people, a family unit, a club, a society, a worship circle. It was everything. Everything was based on the idea of Beitu, of community. It was a deeply connected place. Everything that they did was based on the foundation of community. So now I'll introduce you to the pantheon. So before I start, this was a polytheistic society with gods from multiple pantheons included, and there were literally hundreds of gods worshipped in Ugaritic. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go over all of them because we would be here all day. But I wanted to cover the most widely attested, the most commonly seen, the most commonly sacrificed to, and the quote-unquote most important in the pantheon. So first, I want to start with El, the father of gods and of humans. He was known as the ageless one, the father of years. He was associated with time, bulls, fertility. He was thought to dwell on mountaintops and in the mouths of streams. He was the husband, godly consort of Ashira or Astarte, which is a name you may recognize. And he was the head of the godly Marzeo, which is a ritual drinking society. I will get into that more later, so just look forward to hearing more. But while he was the father of the gods, he was not the king. Ashira was his wife. She was the creatress of the gods. She was the mother in their religious texts of over 70 deities that are named to be her children, that she's thought to be the mother of most of the gods. She was associated with a lot of things, a lot of maternal things like healing. She was also associated with animals and Sidon and Tyre, which are separate civilizations. This is a repeated theme. You'll actually see the gods depicted traveling and associated with other places other than Ugarit. It wasn't important that they were in Ugarit. All that mattered was that they were paying attention to Ugarit. She was very active in myth, particularly the Baal cycle, which is one of the primary myths of Ugaritic religion. She actually convinces her husband to support the king of the gods' kingship and his resurrection from the dead. And she also finds Baal's successor after his death, showing that women, particularly queens, wives, mothers, did have a certain amount of power, at least in the godly realm. But here is probably our most important god. If you don't remember anybody else, remember him. This is Baal. He is the king of the gods. He is the most active in myth. You see him everywhere. He is the personification of so many of the most important things to their civilization, namely storms, fertility, and order. And he was also the patron god of the cult of the dead, particularly for the royal family. He had many consorts, but primarily his consort was Anat, the warrior goddess, and he is the protagonist of the Baal cycle, one of the primary religious myths. He wins his kingship from Yam, who is the personification of chaos, symbolizing his rule and the institution of kingship as a form of order over the people to save them from descending into chaos. He dies in myth and is resurrected with the help of several other gods, namely his consort Anat, who actually travels to the underworld and kills the god of death. He also returns to life periodically, even though he does die again. It's thought that he attends banquets and will resurrect periodically with the cult of the dead and will actually appear to people on occasion. So here is Anat. She is probably my favorite out of the entire pantheon, but don't tell the others that I said that. She is everything. She is the woman of virginity, widowhood, war, sovereignty, the sky, animals, warriors, love, sex, healing, and destruction. So if you're praying to somebody, it better be her. She actually has origins outside of Ugarit. It's not clear if she actually originated there, even though she is one of their most important goddesses. It's thought that she might have originated in Amorite tradition, and while she's only one of many of Baal's consorts, she doesn't seem to have any other consorts in myth. She is also an incredibly formidable warrior. She is the killer of literal death. She also kills the Leviathan, the mythical monster, as well as Akatu in the Tale of Akatu. She is the representative of Baal while he's in the underworld, speaking on his behalf and taking over things, and she aids in his resurrection, again, by killing death. She also, it's very important to mention, is always described as adolescent. She's never fully a woman. Even though she is a goddess and she is associated with love and sex and widowhood, she is always depicted as young, which does lend to her personification as a warrior because it was considered slightly taboo for women to be warriors. So her perpetual adolescence for her entire immortal life enabled her to have this role as the goddess of war. And then there's Shapshu. Unfortunately, there are very, very, very few depictions of her in art, but she is the personification of the sun. She is known as the lantern of the gods. She is the messenger of the gods. She is also the shepherd of human souls to the underworld. So whenever you die, it's thought that Shapshu would come to you and take your soul safely to the underworld. She also is the one in the Baal cycle who finds Baal's soul and brings him back to the world of the living after he dies, enabling his resurrection, because otherwise he would have been lost without her. She is also the goddess most commonly sacrificed to when someone is trying to get in contact with a member of the dead or a member of the gods, because she does have the ability to cross primordial planes. And then there's Dagon. He is one of two gods who has a preserved temple in Ugarit, the other being Baal. Dagon's was leveled, so we don't exactly have as much information on it as Baal's, but he was thought to be the god of grain. He's occasionally Baal's father in myth, but not every time. So only occasionally is he Baal's father. But as the god of grain, he was incredibly important to a civilization that needed to subsist off of agriculture. So it was very important for him to be sacrificed to, and he was incredibly, incredibly important, even though he is not particularly active in myth. And then there are a lot of minor gods. There are hundreds of minor gods, and I'm going to focus on the ones that are most important in myth and most commonly seen in ritual assemblages. So first there's Horanu. He is the god of magic. He appears occasionally in myth. He is also quite commonly sacrificed to, which is kind of surprising as his primary function is magic. And then there's Yarib. He is the personification of the moon, the inverse of Shapshu. He appears a lot throughout myth, but doesn't really seem to have a very active role, isn't sacrificed to a lot, but he is also associated with dogs for some reason. Avatar is the personification of the planet Venus, and yet another one of Baal's enemies. In a myth, they fight. Baal obviously wins because he is the hero of the day, the king, and Avatar is defeated. Kothar Wakasis, or Heya, actually is attested in multiple cultures, which is why there are multiple names. They are the god of wisdom. They're not particularly active in myth, but they are important enough to be sacrificed to. And then there are the Kataratu. They are the 7 handmaidens of a childbirth deity from another culture that is actually the primary childbirth deity in Ugarit. They are always seen together and always kind of an assistant to childbirth. You would see sacrifices to them in places where people were giving birth and wanted healthy babies. They wanted to make sure that that childbirth went very smoothly. And then there are Baal's daughters. It's unclear in myth who their mother is, but we can reasonably assume it's probably Anat. But all of them are associated with precipitation and fertility. Arcee is the one that we see the most in myth, and I'll actually cover her a little bit more in depth in the next slide. But then there's Tili, the goddess of showers, Pidger, the goddess of dew. Yuburdmi, Uzert, and Betel don't quite have distinct functions on their own, but they are both associated with precipitation and fertility rituals. There are also lots of foreign deities. The primary god of childbirth in Ugarit was actually Nekal, a Sumerian god, and he was accompanied by the Kataratu almost all the time, and a lot of their gods, hundreds of their gods, had Hurrian origins. So the Hurrians were a neighboring civilization. They were never in power over Ugarit, but they weren't particularly close either. But in the Acropolis, there are actually 2 priestly houses. The house of the head priest and the house of a Hurrian priest, where we see religious texts from both Hurrian and Ugaritic origins alongside one another. We can actually see in the historical assemblages that the gods, even when they had overlapping functions, were actually worshipped alongside each other as equals. The god father in the Hurrian pantheon is actually the equivalent of El, but they're worshipped together a lot of the time in Eucharist. I'm not going to read through this whole list because there are so many of them, but all of these are just the main Hurrian gods that we see. There are hundreds more. And then there are the underworld deities. There's Mot, the god of death. He's obviously killed by a gnat in the ball cycle. He does not come back. But he is relatively replaced by Reshef, who is a plague god, and he becomes king of the underworld after Mot is killed by a gnat. And then there's Nergal, who's a slightly lesser plague god. We don't see him a lot in myth, but he is still there. But Reshef is the most common of the underworld deities to be sacrificed to be seen in sacrificial assemblages. And then there's Arsi, the daughter of Baal. She is the chthonic goddess of the earth. So she is the personification of the ground that you walk on. And she also has the association with death, as the tombs are underground. You're thought to return to the earth and go to the underworld. So now to get into the cult of the dead. It wasn't just the gods that were part of the religious tradition, it was also your ancestors. And while many people were not deified, it was still very important to respect the dead. There were tombs built under most dwellings that would house family members from 2 to maximum 4 generations back, depending on how much space you had. And they were actually thought to be still living. You would consider them the same as you would someone else living in your family home. You would go and bring them meals, you would give sacrifices to them, you would go and visit and consider them when you're counting the number of people in your household. So there would have been a tomb caretaker likely within the family who would have been in charge of tomb maintenance, making sure that they have appropriate sacrifices, making sure that the lamps are lit and nothing's burrowed and everything is in its place. But this is the blueprints of what a tomb would have looked like. You would have had bodies, and these were most commonly underneath residential dwellings. And like I said before, the dead are considered active parts of the family unit, and they're honored for several generations, typically until their name is forgotten. But some were worshipped after death as gods. Primarily royals were deified after death, and it was still uncommon at that. But offerings were regularly provided for their dead. They would have offered parts of their meals, libations, etc. And it was thought that the spirits were present and accessible to their loved ones. You could talk to them, you could communicate with them in a real way. It was thought that if you made an offering to Shapshu saying, please tell my dead grandfather that I love him and thank you for the armor, it was thought that that message would be conveyed. But mourning was also an incredibly important part of religious tradition, particularly for the cult of the dead. So mourning rituals would actually last for up to 7 years and would be performed by the entire community. The extended mourning period would likely only be observed by the family of the deceased, but the entire community would band together as a whole to mourn the loss of any community member who died, at least during the beginning. And this involved continuous displays of despair. It wasn't quite like the Victorian mourning period where you would wear all black and just look really sad. It was a little more intense than that. It would be segregated by gender, yes, but women would mourn by weeping and wailing and tearing at their hair, and men would mourn by cutting themselves and libating their blood onto the ground in mourning for the fallen. So there was also an actual religious structure. This wasn't just independent of any sort of authority, any sort of set of standards. There were actual rules to this. So first, as Max so eloquently explained to us earlier, there was a lot of royal involvement. The king was the supreme officiant of all religious rituals, regardless of whether he was actually present or not. He could delegate to the high priest to act on his behalf if he didn't come to the sacrifice or the banquet for whatever reason, but it was thought that as Ugert was relatively small, he was probably at most of the major things. The queen also had a special association with sacrifice, and this is actually probably because of Ashira and her importance. She had some sort of role in the sacrificial process, likely as the person who would actually perform the sacrifice or choose the sacrificial animal, but it isn't clear in the text what particularly that role was, and the royal children would have been prominent in processions, likely leading it or playing some sort of very important role while they're leading the sacrifice and the sacrificial procession to the temple. So Baal was, again, the patron of the royal dead. He would be the person to lead them into town for the banquets, to bring them back to life. And the royals were typically depicted interacting with the gods, both in life and in death, though particularly if they were deified after their death. And the royals would have been responsible for authorizing all religious activities and organizations. Nothing would have been happening without their knowledge. And there were also temples. We only retained two, Dagon and Baal, and Dagon's, again, was leveled. But we have reconstructions and we know their floor plans. They were very particularly set up. They had sacrificial altars and also space for religious activities. Typically the altar would be outside, as the main form of sacrifice was immolation and they didn't want to burn their house down. But they would have hosted community funerary rituals, banquets, festivals, anything where a lot of people would have needed to be in attendance, because they had these huge open courtyards and these large spaces where people could gather. Typically there were areas inside of the temple that would have been off limits to most people, with the exception of royalty or priests, but for the most part, religious proceedings would have happened in public. There was also an order of priests. So there would have been shared priests between the different religions exhibited in Ugarit, and so they would have had enough knowledge to perform Hurrian rituals as well as Ugaritic rituals, though there was a considerable overlap. Again, we have the priestly dwellings for both a Hurrian and Ugaritic priest attributed in the Acropolis, and the high priest was the most prominent of that order. He was kind of in charge of everyone. He led most of the religious activities that the king did not lead. And there was also a chief priest who was in charge of the cultic herds, so making sure that there were enough bulls and goats and any other animal that they would want to sacrifice, so they didn't have to rely on community herdsmen who may need the meat for other purposes. Priests and priestesses often served their term for their entire life. They were sold into it as children, as sacrifices to the gods, as a way to thank the gods and give them someone to be at their service 100% of the time. So it was kind of unusual if somebody became a priest later in life. You would have trained for a very, very long time. There were also a lot of other jobs within the temple, namely diviners and cultic scribes. They were the most common, so we would have had people being able to see the future and give people guidance on what to do. And there were also scribes who would write in Ugaritic stories or proceedings or anything important, like an incantation that somebody would commission. You are always able to talk to the gods. It doesn't matter how trivial it is. You can always go to them and say, can you heal this snake bite? Can you make sure I get across safely? Will you come to my birthday party? It's very, very fun, and we see the idea of a sympathetic God carried over into Abrahamic religions for the next 3,000 years. And they also used mind-altering substances in order to further thin that veil, with the expectation that the gods would be there to talk to them and give them access to their world. So I want to thank everyone here for listening to me, all of my professors for being so wonderful to me these past 4 years, and particularly to Dr. Savage, without whom I would not be here. I would never have added a second major, and I cannot thank her enough for this, and also for helping me work through this for the past academic year. So here am I, we're excited. Thank you so much.
questions for after Garrett's talk, and so you could ask Clara or Garrett questions.
So while we're changing the slides, for my students, please remember that your papers are due today. Upload them on Brightspace or give me a paper version. Your next project is due on Tuesday, so do not forget about it, please. Again, for the presentation, so this is our last presentation for today, last student presentation. It is a capstone research project that was done in the fall and carried over during the spring semester, still on the same course on ancient Ugarit. And you can see that students have been looking at a broad variety of subjects. So Garrett will talk to us about another subject that I love, which is maritime trade systems and metallurgy in ancient Ugarit. And Garrett, as Max and Clara has done also a fantastic job. He was not here when I expressed my gratitude and how impressed I am by our seniors, so he also deserved to hear it. They all did a fantastic job, and I am really proud of you. Thank you.
That is absolutely delightful. I'm so sorry I couldn't miss the beginning of this presentation, but the work and passion that everyone has put into their projects is so overwhelmingly obvious in everything we've done this last semester. It's truly wonderful to see. Well, my name is Garrett Collins. Today I'm going to be speaking on metallurgy and the maritime trade systems as they existed in ancient Ugarit. Sorry about that, Dr. Savage. Now, as I was saying, Ugarit is part of the Via Mediterranea naval trade network. This trade network was so important because it connected regions as disparate as Cyprus and Mycenae to Egypt, the Levant, and Mesopotamia. Because Ugarit was so northern, it provided a natural outlet for several inland trade routes, as well as a point of entry for overseas goods into Mesopotamia and Anatolia. Although relevant for centuries, Ugarit reached the pinnacle of its success as a trade center in the late Bronze Age. Of the four notable bays in the Levantine coast, Ras El Fasari and Ras Ibn Hani both appear to be too shallow and too small to sustain significant naval trade. Ras El Basit and Ras Zirbet did not appear to host populations large enough to be major economic players. This made Ugarit's bay of Minat El Beda not only the most successful choice due to its size and inherently beneficial traits, but also the only realistic option for naval trade in this region. More broadly, naval trade was so favorable because it was much faster and required much less upkeep than traditional animal caravans, which required large sums of food and maintenance and repair tools for equipment. While the threat of piracy from the sea people and inclement weather did pose an obstacle to naval trade, and indeed did claim ships on occasion, the benefits were far outweighed by any potential risks. Now, the Ugaritic name for Minat El Beda was Mid, pronounced Mihid, I believe, which means to take. This is linked to the Arabic term Ma'ahad, meaning a place where one takes things. Administrative and clerical records suggest a permanent population of at least 122 adult men at the site. While it clearly hosted a significant permanent population, gauging the actual number of residents is somewhat difficult for a number of factors. Its proximity to Ugarit means port workers could in fact live in the city and perhaps travel to the port by day. Additionally, since the records enumerated only adult men, the actual population could be more than triple that when accounting for families, assuming an average of one spouse and one child per household. This number, then expanded by the crews of docked ships, dock workers, and slaves, could result in over 1,000 individuals in the city at any given time. This is so significant because it rivals the nearby city of Ugarit itself in terms of population. The presence of household tombs and other civil infrastructure at the site seems to support this idea further. Of the two nearby bays, Ras Ibn Hani appeared to play a more significant supplementary role as a seasonal residence for members of the royal family, from which they could navigate the logistics and complexities of a trade network of this scale. This function would have only served to strengthen the economic power of the primary site. In addition to serving as a seasonal home for Ugaritic royalty, Ras Ibn Hani appears to have been a major production center for the city. When ingot mold was found at Ras Ibn Hani, proving that the outpost played a crucial role in the metallurgical trade as well. The ingot mold appears to have been a relatively unique discovery in the region, demonstrating the extreme level of control imposed on the production of workable ingots, as well as a further support of the notion that metal production was a largely palatial affair. This means it was managed by the palace or royalty of a given empire. This particular mold produced ingots of the oxhide style, which got its name from their strange shape, which were said to depict an ox skin when stretched over a sort of tanning bed. Ras Ibn Hani may have also served as a production center for extremely valuable purple dye and purple fabrics, which could be produced from local murex shells. Then they would be transported the short distance to Minat el-Beida for sale or shipment overseas. Surviving records from Mihid, as well as the city of Ugarit, attest to advanced maritime activities, such as large-scale fleet coordination and, perhaps most interestingly, cargo recovery efforts from sunken ships. One known cargo recovery mission involved retrieving goods from a shipwreck near the Lebanese city of Tyre. Egyptian tomb paintings as early as the 5th dynasty depict Egyptian ships crewed by Syrian sailors, representing an extensive exchange not only of trade goods with the distant power, but also individuals and culture as well. One significant exchange between Hittite king Abranu and Amurapi of Ugarit, circa the 12th century BCE, involved the former requesting a ship capable of transporting 2,000 measures of grain. In terms of modern measurements, this is approximately 450 tons. A ship capable of transporting such vast quantities of goods would have necessarily been both large and required extremely advanced engineering, shipbuilding, and construction. This demonstrates a tremendous functional skill in shipbuilding as well as the scale of trade, which happened in Ugarit. That this request came at a time of strife for both the Hittite and Ugaritic people seems to further suggest that such ships of vast capacity, as well as the sailors capable of crewing them, must have necessarily existed for some time beforehand. It is worth noting that King Ibranu may have made this request spitefully due to Amurapi's spurning of his ex-wife, the Hittite king's daughter. However, if this was the case, the malicious act would have probably been the request for such a vast quantity of grain rather than an impossibly large ship to carry the goods. Now, I'd like to expand on this idea of Levantine sailors existing in foreign cultures, both in the material record but also as figments of artistry at the time. As I mentioned, several Egyptian tomb paintings depict Levantine sailors staffing Egyptian ships and conducting trade. Levantine people are typically identifiable by their lighter skin tones, often colorful styles of dress, and pronounced beards especially. It is unclear whether the sailors depicted in these tomb paintings were meant to be slaves or hired workers, but the distinction is functionally relevant for this conversation, in that both cases result in the presence or normalization of Levantine sailors in Egypt and other regions and on foreign ships. Levantine sailors also appear to have regularly ventured to foreign lands for the purposes of trade and diplomacy, with one notable depiction being the Syrian supplicants found in the Viceroy Rakhmire's tomb circa the 14th century BCE. They're depicted here carrying offerings to the Egyptian pharaoh. Administrative records from Saqqara dated to the Old Kingdom included a list of sailors, many of which seemed to bear Syrian names, providing yet another material link between these two disparate powers. Now, lexical confusion can somewhat complicate the attribution of ships to their certain places of origin. This is important when you're discussing the relevancy or scale of impact of Levantine sailors on the broader region, the broader Mediterranean region. One example would be the term Byblos ships. This name seems to suggest a relationship between the Levant and Egypt during the Old Kingdom. However, the nature of this relationship is somewhat unclear, even today. This lack of clarity may refer to ships going to or coming from Byblos, or ships simply built in the style of those found in Byblos, or something else entirely. Due to this lack of clarity, administrative records and written attestations of Levantine individuals, as well as the material records of different regions, serve as the best metrics for determining the scope of this trade and interaction. The discovery of Mycenaean rhytons and stirrup-handled jars in Ugarit suggest, once again, support the notion of their tremendous sailing prowess. Discovered in 1982, the Urlaburan shipwreck provides perhaps the most complete and comprehensive insight into the Bronze Age maritime trade. Located off the coast of Turkey near modern-day Kos, it was not of Ugaritic origin, more likely Phoenicia or Canaan, but it was likely built in the same style as those used in Ugarit at this time. The ship was exceptionally rich in goods at the time of its sinking and included a wide range of luxury and utilitarian objects. Most interestingly to me, the ship contained 10 tons of copper and 1 ton of tin in workable ingots. This ratio of tin to copper ingots reflects the ideal ratio for forming high-strength bronze, suggesting that it was intended to be smelted into bronze at some eventual endpoint. The presence of finished bronze works alongside raw materials to produce bronze reflects a clear and directed effort to control the distribution of workable bronze. Whereas finished objects could be clearly enumerated and sold to the palace, bronze ingots had multifarious uses and were consequently strictly controlled. Ships may have transported raw materials to avoid it falling into the hands of pirates or perhaps private merchants. Now, this idea of private merchants in Ugarit is a subject of high debate even today, especially between Dr. Savage and myself. One possible indicator for private trade are surviving ship registers. One such register describes 12 heavy and 4 light ships, which are associated with specific individuals. The fact that these individuals were described as possessing these ships does seem to imply some level of private ownership. However, they could simply be acting on behalf of the palace as captains. These ships were described as Ant-Mihid, meaning ships from Ma'hadu. In the context of the whole register, this seems to imply a place of construction or their current docking, rather than a form of ownership. The regulation of certain trade goods, such as those workable bronze ingots again, imply that various contemporary powers didn't want sailors to have access to such resources. As I mentioned, this could have been done to protect against piracy, but the presence of large stores of bronze weapons seemed to make this unlikely. Rather, the decision appears to have been made to minimize the risk of skimming from the sailors themselves. It is much easier to steal shavings from a number of ingots, for example, rather than from finished jewelry or equipment. This precaution likely wouldn't have been necessary if sailors were universally agents of the palace. One does have to consider that the incentive to steal would still exist had they been agents of the palace, but the inherent benefits would have been tremendously greater if they were on a private venture. There are a number of arguments against private trade which we must consider in the grand scope of this argument, one of which is the lack of private ship sales in the city. If private trade constituted such a major portion of the city's economy, one would expect to find records of ship sales explicitly identifying either owners or merchant ventures. Of course, the biggest obstacle to providing private trading would have been the prohibitive cost. It would have been tremendously expensive at the time. State sponsorship would have likely ameliorated this concern, but it does raise some questions as to how much autonomy such merchants would have from the palace if they agree to take such a deal. The vast majority of these palatial records denoted only state-managed trade, specifically diplomatic exchange, so they did not necessarily speak to the high volume of general trade which would have occurred on the day-to-day in the city. Some researchers further suggest that economic records would have only been stored for short periods of time, on the span of decades, before being destroyed and replaced, meaning that the vast majority of the city's trade history would have been lost by the time of its eventual destruction. Whew. Now, having described all of the context and function and mechanisms by which trade could exist in the ancient world, and especially in Ugarit, we can now talk about some of the specific goods of tremendous value. Of each of the 4 primary metals which constituted the ancient metallurgical trade appear to have primarily one point of origin and a number of satellite smaller origins. Gold in this case came primarily from Egypt, silver primarily from Anatolia, copper primarily from Cyprus, and tin has more dubious origins, but recent research seems to suggest a origin in Armenia or Afghanistan. The logistics of maintaining these crucial trade routes appears to have been jointly shared by all involved parties, all involved powers, and demands extensive negotiation and diplomacy to function. Even as Ugarit's extensive power waned due to Egypt's growing centrality and the conquering of northern Syria in the 14th century BCE, it maintained strong diplomatic ties with Egypt right up until its eventual destruction. New trade centers such as Ashkelon and Ashdod redirected trade away from Ugarit, but likewise supported established ties, political ties at the time. Written correspondences, such as the clay tablet from the Hittite king Tudhaliya IV, depicted here, would have been widely used to update foreign powers on matters of state and sealed with elaborate decorative stamps in the form of signature. Gold was used primarily for the manufacturing of jewelry and artwork. However, it did seem to serve a minor role as a form of high-value currency. A contract recovered from Ugarit attested to a private buyer purchasing the right to collect taxes in Mihid for 400 gold shekels. This may actually be the earliest known instance of a practice called tax farming. Contemporary gold jewelry seemed to favor large pendant-style works or thick jewelry bands, or extremely small, intricate pendants, which were meant to showcase the skill of the craftsman. Many such artifacts were recovered from the Uluburun shipwreck, alongside vast arrays of weapons and raw materials. The majority of Egyptian gold was sourced from Nubia until approximately 1100 BCE. The fact that the Egyptian word for gold, nub, seems to be a derivation of Nubia seems to support this idea. Prior to advanced mining infrastructure, most gold was extracted from alluvial deposits along riverbeds via panning. Because gold is so much denser than most other river grit, it would tend to accumulate in points where rivers change direction or at bends. Panners would traditionally work over animal pelts or cloth blankets to catch falling gold dust. In Nubia, it is believed that cloth bundles were particularly favored. These bundles would often be called golden fleeces. These fleeces would be collected and burned afterwards to release any trapped gold dust and to smelt them into usable ingots. The use of the term golden fleece in mythology, such as the Argonautica, likely traces its origin back to a dramatization of this common practice. Finished gold Egyptian ingots ranged in purity from 72.1% to 96.4%, marking both a volumetric abundance of gold in the region as well as a relatively high quality supply of a finished product. Silver served as the primary currency in Ugarit, as well as much of the ancient Near East. While silver can be extracted from a number of natural alloys, argentiferous, that is, silver mixed with lead, appeared to be the most common form in the ancient world. Chemical analysis of silver samples from Ugarit suggests that much of it came from Anatolian mines in modern-day Turkey, specifically a region called the Bulkar Mountain Range. The Bulkar Mountain Range consisted of over 800 individual mines with evidenced operation for more than a century. In addition to the exceptionally rich silver deposits in the region, it was heavily forested and crossed by several rivers, which provided a natural source of resources for mining and smelting infrastructure at the site. It is unclear to what degree slaves contributed to these mining efforts, as they did in Egypt. However, it is believed that it was a minor role, if there was any at all, due to its decentralized nature. Cyprus, also likely known as Alashia, appears to have been the provider of much of the copper in the ancient world. Record-keeping tablets made of Cypriot clay found in Amarna and Ugarit self-identify as coming from Alashia. As with many documents referencing this location, the tablets dealt extensively with the production of copper. These tablets made reference to copper, mountain copper, and refined fine quality copper, representing a highly developed line of production for different types of copper, as well as a complex understanding of their different use cases. Cyprus appears to have hosted a number of highly productive copper mines that lasted for centuries or sometimes significantly longer. The examination of slag heaps from Cyprus suggests a relatively uninterrupted production line of workable copper that lasted for thousands of years. The Skaratusa mine was likely the longest continually operated mine in Cyprus, and it dominated mining in the region by the Ptolemaic period. Large-scale copper mining and production efforts appear to have begun in Cyprus as early as 2500 BCE. Unfortunately, modern mining efforts in the early 1900s have destroyed much of the ancient infrastructure on the island, making identification extraordinarily difficult. Renewed excavation efforts in the 1970s resulted in some sites, such as the ancient Skaratusa mine, resuming active excavation, which persists even today. It was traditionally assumed that ancient tin was sourced from the Karadak region of Armenia. However, more recent chemical analysis has suggested that Afghanistan might be a major contributor. If tin was indeed sourced from Armenia, it suggests that the famed city of Troy might have served as a fortification protecting the transport of tin through the Dardanelles into the region. In this case, tin might have passed through the Black Sea into the Mediterranean and back to Ugarit from Cyprus or Mycenae. Large quantities of lapis lazuli from Afghanistan have been found in the Mediterranean as well, meaning that the trade between these cities must have existed despite the vast distance. Instances of lapis lazuli from Afghanistan have been identified in Egypt as early as the 4th millennium BC, and in the royal necropolis of Ur as early as the 2nd millennium, attesting to not only the existence but the incredible age of many of these trade routes. It is reasonable then to assume that tin might have followed these same paths towards Ugarit. Overland trade from Armenia to Ugarit certainly would have been possible, but would have almost certainly taken a backseat to any form of naval trade, due again to the benefits to speed and efficiency. Isotopic analysis of Eastern Mediterranean tin ingots further suggests that Egypt may have contributed minorly to the trade. However, the scale to which this was relevant is not at this time known. Having covered all of the major mechanisms and broad facts as to materials used, we come to the central question of why does this ultimately matter? Metalworks played a critical role in cultural and technological development in an almost entirely unique way. They served as a key medium for preserving and celebrating mythology, history, and art. Luxury artifacts, such as this beautiful gold bowl, demonstrate a rich pattern of cultural exchange in the ancient world. This so-called international style this bowl was constructed in combined elements of numerous foreign cultures into a single unified art form, typically for the purposes of diplomacy or cultural understanding. The circular register utilized in this bowl might have actually originated in the Levant before transferring into the Aegean in the form of famous mythological artifacts such as the shield of Achilles or Aeneas. The Levantine style this Levantine international style first appeared in the 13th century BCE and eventually developed into that traditional Phoenician style we recognize today. Additionally, the complementary cup that went along with this bowl, it was found in a similar region to this bowl, appeared to utilize a carinated contour of the type popularized in Egypt. that is all to say that the value of cultural exchange as it manifested in the material culture of these peoples was of overwhelming importance. Furthermore, shared cultural icons such as the eponymous bull, significant to so many different Mediterranean religions, appeared in much of this work as well. Altogether, this provides us a clear and remarkably well documented network of connections between these disparate peoples in the truly ancient world. Of course, there are far too many thanks to fit onto today's presentation, but I will direct them first at Dr. Savage. Your passion for your work and your assistance in the jumbled mess that eventually became this presentation and the paper along with it were absolutely vital. Further thanks to all of my fellow classmates and graduating seniors, without whose work the Ugarit exhibit in the library would never have been possible, and the incredible work that you put into everything you do, all of you, staff and students alike, is so much of why I wanted to be an archaeologist. It gives me hope for the future. Thank you so much.
Fantastic job there, Gary. So, yeah. Here is what we hope we can do. Why don't you come up with Clara for a few questions, and we're gonna navigate time a little bit. Following this, it's not gonna be more than 5 minutes. We're gonna go for lunch, and I'll ask you to take the lunch and take your seats so that we can continue with the next part, which is awards, introducing 2 more faculty, and then 1 faculty talk. Will be done by 1:30, I promise. Okay.
Does anybody have, we'll take 2 questions, so does anybody have a question for Claire?
So for the underworld deities that you mentioned, people actually sacrifice them, or was there a taboo against worshiping these?
No, people sacrifice to them actually quite often. Reshef is actually one of the most sacrificed to deities in the Ugaritic pantheon. It was mostly prayers and sacrifices, basically with the thesis statement of "please don't kill me or my family." He was also a plague god, so he was the god of pestilence, so it was also very important for them to sacrifice to him to say, I would love for my crops to live, like my wife is pregnant, I want our baby to be healthy, please don't take these things from me.
Thank you.
A question for Garrett?
I just wanted to commend you because you say he started as a mess, but actually that's how scholarship starts. So the fact that you were able to identify where all these precious materials came from and find ways that they can connect and create artifacts and even bring in associations with the ancient world as mysteries. What is the Golden Fleece? This is really wonderful, and I hope you'll continue with the same curiosity to dig deeper and making connections. So, wonderful job, Gary.
I jest, of course, but I truly wouldn't have it any other way. The opportunity and infrastructure here to allow me to dive so deeply into such a niche and specific part of the ancient world is really just a fantastic resource, and I'm so grateful for it.
And here is where we all applaud and tell you, oh, sorry, one more? Yes. Yes.
I actually had a question. With the circulation of metal, if you have any thoughts on recycling and kind of the role of these big militaries moving throughout the landscape as playing a role in kind of driving market demand, and then if that has connected or your thoughts here, the control of metals in the palace.
This is a phenomenal question, and you're letting me talk about something I found really, really cool I couldn't fit into my presentation. This is perfect. It is a really interesting and very fragile network of relations that allowed this sort of trade system to exist. Many of these ancient societies found in some ways found each other to be at a almost impasse. They had to have diplomatic relations because the presence of these minerals or materials was so absolutely vital. We do see palaces almost universally agreeing that the production of ingots being the most malleable and arguably valuable form of metal had to be very strongly regulated. So we see production plants consolidated almost universally into palatial towers. The case of the ingot mold, for example, at Rasi Bethani was the only one in the region. Perhaps the most important takeaway I seem to have found is that military presences were secondary to the sort of economic trade. The threat of war was almost, at this time, secondary to the threat of loss of resources, especially for a place like Ugarit, which is, in many respects, resource deficient. It relies so heavily on its prime location to facilitate its growth as a city. So we see drastic steps being taken to preserve diplomatic bonds, even in the case of absurd requests, like the Hittite king demanding a ridiculous sum of grain during a period of famine in the city of Ugarit. It was a request that would have been likely filled due to the paramount importance of preserving those connections for future trade and development. In terms of recycling, we also just see a lot of pieces being melted down and reused in cases where they could be done so. Thank you.
Thank you, Garrett. I think we're going to pause and thank all of the students. Could we ask you to kind of, as you can, in order, go and get food and sit back here? Because as you sit, I will introduce our award winner for this year and our next speaker. So if you can maybe start from the back and go row by row so we can keep some order if possible, and then bring your food. You can be eating as we do this. Hopefully, by the time I finish this, we'll be at the point where I can also announce our big award. So the drum roll will come, okay? So let me first thank profusely Dr. Heidi Fessler. And as I said, she, along with Dr. Ben Radcliffe, are the ones that organized this event today. I also want to thank Isabel Davis, who is our Senior Administrative Coordinator, who ordered all the food and organized all this space. Woo! And of course, all faculty and students for being here. So first, a big applause for all of us being here and sharing the work of our students. Let me say a couple of things about Heidi. Heidi studied at the University of California in Los Angeles. Yes, our neighboring university, UCLA, where a number of our adjuncts studied. She has a PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, and she will be teaching the Introduction to Near Eastern Languages course that she started in the fall. So sign up for this course if you're interested in the field. She also has an MA from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, and also studied at the Jerusalem University College in Israel. She has been with us for, I believe, more than 4 years, and that's why I had the permission to announce that both Heidi and Ben have been promoted to senior lecturers. So thank you again. As I am, let me pull this up. So I also wanted to introduce you and just share a story that you may be tired of hearing it. But you know, it all starts at this point where you're students and you're taught by professors and you learn and change so much. One of the students that was asking me about the Greek alphabet a long time ago, and that's why I misremember the dates. In 2009, Chris Gibson and Jordan Christopher came to this university to study, and Chris Gibson, like you, was very curious about language and literature, and I had a lot of students, and we spent a lot of time training students for learning the language, grading, and you know, this takes a long time. So I thought, this student is doing quite well. Let me develop this class, which is a practicum of teaching classical languages, so I can have somebody help me grade the papers. So Chris Gibson started gradually, like Tanya, like Clara, coming into our offices more and more and taking new responsibilities. Well, fast forward, Chris graduated having taken 6 courses with me, and his capstone received a 5-year scholarship to go to Urbana-Champaign and finish his PhD. And the title of the PhD, those who've taken classes with him know, is Cannibalism and Anthropophagy in Greek Literature. And as I said, at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. So when he was finishing up, we created a postdoc position for him that he has occupied for the last 3 years, teaching a number of courses, including Greek and Latin, epic, and myth, and gender and sexuality in the ancient world. I'm happy to announce to you that as of now, Chris has been promoted to an instructor, which means he can stay with us as long as he wants to. And this position is renewed. It's not yet a tenure track position, but we hope and we will continue to work towards turning this into a tenure track position. So let's congratulate Chris. And of course, I said the drum roll. Every year we have the chance, due to a very generous gift by Father O'Neill, who has an endowment gift, to award the student with the highest GPA. I can tell you this is really hard because this year maybe they were apart by 1 or 2 or 3. I mean, it was so close. But and I hope we will find a chance to reward all our seniors because they've done such a tremendous amount of work and we're really proud of them. The certificate of the O'Neill Endowed Award goes to Max Nicolais. It also comes with a $500 check that will arrive in the mail for you. So there you have it. So how about a little moment of come up here, hold this, and your family who's here can take a couple of photographs in.
Thank you very much.
Of course, there you are. Congratulations.
Thank you.
So there.
Thank you.
You're very welcome, Max. Thank you. Okay, so the last part of this wonderful event every year, and let me tell you, this event, this is the 18th year we're doing this. The reason why I thought would be really good is because parents need to celebrate with us what the students that they have entrusted to us have done during their tenure here. And so I'm very glad we're recording it, and I want to thank all those who are doing this recording for us, and we will post in hopefully 10 days on the landing page of our Classics in Archaeology site. So, I wanted to introduce to you our next speaker. I said a couple of things about Dr. Elliot Piros before. I recently started reading the research proposal for his book project, and I thought I should read like a couple of sentences so you can see what his interests are. How did people in monetized zones of the Roman world perceive monetary value? And how in particular did enslaved and freed people understand and articulate their relation to commodification? His book project constitutes an history of the aesthetics of money and commodities in the Roman world, from the Punic Wars down to late antiquity. It supposes that money and the commodity were objects of aesthetic perception, and that their aesthetic dimensions have been under-recognized in scholarship or studied mostly in moral or ethical frameworks. It also supposes that these objects were ontologically ambivalent or even unstable, and so much brought about torsions in verbal, visual, and somatic discourses. So that's his ongoing work. I've heard papers by Dr. Piros before. He's erudite. He's a brilliant scholar, and we're very happy to have him here. So Elliot, please. Yes, the title of your talk, Animate Objects, Money and Roman Slavery. Okay, there you have it.
Yeah, that's fun. So thank you very much. And let me just say it's been really fun day so far. So hopefully I can continue with the fun. Sometimes when you come up with an idea for a talk, it's months before the talk. So the first idea for the title was a little, I don't know if you can tell, a little vague. It just basically had some nouns that I strung together. So then I've come up with a more pointed title, Money as Substance of Kinship in the Roman World. So what I'm going to do today, hi, I'm Dr. Elliot Pyros. First, I'm a Roman social historian, so I look at basically three things in the Roman world. The history of social structures that shaped lived experience, and then the experience of these structures, and then also thirdly, experience that can't be really defined in terms of structure. So and it's a lot of technical terms, but to think about it through a sort of modern example or contemporary example, like with myself, you know, I could say I'm a white man, so those things would be maybe part of the social structures of our world, whiteness, masculinity, these things have a history, what's the history of those things, and then what's my experience of those things. But then I have experiences in my life that aren't defined by those two things. So all three components make up social history, but for ancient Rome in this case. And I work primarily with textual evidence, specifically literary evidence. So today I'm going to talk to you about an idea that I'm pursuing in my research. I've written a couple articles, or an article and a book chapter about this idea, but I'm pursuing it in the context of a book that I'm working on. And I'll talk about the theoretical background to this idea, and then also some scholarship that's helped me refine it. And then I'll talk you through a little bit of a key piece of evidence that's going to be in this idea. So in a nutshell, and the idea here I'm posing as a sort of question, and when you do research, a lot of times your research questions, it's a lot of nouns, and each of the nouns has a very, there's a lot to say about each one. So this question may not be clear now, but I promise by the end of the talk, I'll talk you through what I mean with each part of it. So did money function as a substance of kinship among freed and possibly enslaved people in the Roman world? And then also sort of how, if so, how? How did that happen? And when you work on textual or literary evidence, I mean, every once in a while something new is discovered, but it's much less regular than with archaeological evidence. So a lot of times you're looking for new insights on things that have been studied for sometimes thousands, or at least hundreds of years. So it's kind of hard to come up with new ideas. So for this idea, it's an exciting possibility to contribute to two areas of scholarship. One is on the history of Roman slavery, and the other is on the history of commodification in Rome. And so for the history of slavery component, I'm working on the identification of kinship and kinship relations among enslaved and formerly enslaved people. So the Romans had slavery, but they also had an institution called manumission, freedom from slavery. So there were people who were freed, formerly enslaved people. And my question is, how did these people form kin relations, especially since a lot of them were subjected to what is referred to as natal alienation. So being alienated or taken away from the conditions of birth. And then also, why did people who were subjected to commodification, bought and sold in markets, why would they have pursued identities around not just wealth in general, but specifically wealth in the form of money? So we've seen already today a lot of other forms of wealth. So monetary value had an appeal for the people I'm going to talk about today, and why. So then, I'm not going to talk too much today about these other things, but basically I'll mention there's a lot to say about the ancient economy. We don't have time to get into that today, but basically what I'm talking about here is a small subset of people, wealthy, formerly enslaved people who had a lot of interactions with financial and commercial objects. So they inhabited a particularly monetized part of Roman life. They used money. That wasn't true for most people. And then also thinking about the kind of aesthetic perception of monetary value. So those are the kind of four areas of my research. So let's first talk about this idea of kinship, or this topic of kinship. So kinship is a major part of anthropology, and there's other words for it. Sometimes you'll find it discussed as family studies, but there's basically three key components of kinship studies that come into my research: the rule-oriented approaches, the linguistically based approaches, and then the kind of attempt to move beyond roles and rules. So in the rule-oriented approaches, there's two major ideas that are developed mostly in the 1800s. And one is that kin relations, relationships between members of families, but also kin relationships that go beyond the family, are the way that individuals in society are regulated before the emergence of states. This is an idea that belongs to a different era of scholarship. But the thinking there, and this was in part developed by scholars of law in Rome especially, was that if you understand kinship relations in the earliest phase of social development, you can understand a lot about later developments in society. Especially then for Rome, there's this argument that's made that kinship is primarily defined not through biology, by people having, for example, the same genes, but primarily instead through law, through law that enshrines earlier elements of society. So then another way to think about kinship is what's called linguistically based approaches. So if you look at, for example, the Roman world, there's a lot of terms for people in families or in kinship groups, and these terms can be studied closely, and so our understanding of kinship can be advanced by close linguistic study of these terms. So for example, in the Roman world, there's a word mater terra, which means the sister of a mother, or mother's sister. And this is different from the amita, who's the father's sister. So there's two distinct words, and each of those words reference a lot of cultural norms and ideals. For example, how is a mother's sister supposed to act versus how is a father's sister supposed to act? These words can be the basis for understanding larger kinship networks. So then, the problem with these first two sets of approaches is that they can often cast people in a society as being a little bit robotic, as people sort of going through their lives, following rules, following scripts that are handed down to them. Oh, you're a mother's sister, this is how you're supposed to act, therefore that's how your life is going to be. So in more recent decades, there's been an attempt to kind of flesh out kinship studies by first of all just dividing kinship studies into three levels of analysis. So one, individual behaviors. Look at, for example, maybe how is my mother's sister? What does she do? And then norms, statistically average norms. So, okay, all the mother's sisters, all the mater terrae in a social group, how do they act? And then ideals, what are mother's sisters supposed to do? So these three things help to differentiate and make it possible to understand individual agency within societies. And then also just to characterize kinship as something that is precarious. It's not just a given in a society. It has to be contested or constructed through various practices, a lot of which we've heard mentioned about today, like funerary commemorations or biography writing or history writing or medical treatises. So kinship always has to be kind of established and reestablished. And then one approach that I've come to draw a lot on in my work for thinking about the kinship of the enslaved or formerly enslaved people is summarized in a kind of play on words by this scholar, Elizabeth Freeman up at UC Davis. She talks about how there's maybe a better way to think about kinship is in terms of goals, because there are people who don't necessarily have terms, or we've lost the terms for the positions in their kinship groups. And so instead we have to think about the goals they were pursuing. And a lot of kinship formations are there to pursue the goal of belonging to social groups, but then also being long. In other words, like continuing to exist after death. So it's kind of fun to have a little play on words, but it organizes a lot of important ideas. So belonging to groups, but also being around for potentially some time after your death through, for example, commemoration and people who commemorate you. So belonging to groups who will then ensure that you belong once you've died. So then, there's a lot of scholarship here. What am I taking away from it? Basically, yeah, I mean, there is something we can say about structural analysis of terms, but how do we look at kinship groups among people that don't necessarily have words like mater terra or amita for their positions or their roles in kinship groups? And then if we're thinking about individual behaviors versus norms versus ideals, how do we think about the interactions between those three things when we're looking at kinship groups? Instead of just saying, okay, this is what people were supposed to do, can we also ask, what were people actually doing? And then how were individuals sort of deviating or enforcing, deviating from or enforcing either norms or ideals? So I know that's a lot of somewhat dense anthropological background, but there's another part of it too. So I started to zero in on an idea of what's called substance in kinship studies. And this is the basic idea that, following from the work of Janet Karsten and Marshall Solins, who are anthropologists, that kinship groups are established a lot of times with reference to certain substances. So some of them, I'm going to kind of focus in on the second bullet point. So Marshall Solins talks about how kinship is a sort of mutuality of being existing together that's built through consubstantiality, which basically means the sharing of substances. So some of these substances are ones that you might expect, things like substances that belong to the body, so blood, semen, milk, bone, genes, flesh. Kinship groups may form sort of identities based around the fact that they share and partake in these same substances, either through sexual procreation or through other means, eating together and so forth. But there's oftentimes kinship groups that are formed in relation to substances that are not part of the human body, like the house or the home, or parts of the home, like the land around it, or the hearth, the interior of the home. So these substances, to use a kind of general term for it, many different candidates for substances within kinship groups, but they seem to either form sort of an idea that this kinship group partakes in a sort of vital substance that helps to form it over time in ways that are not given but have to be contested and constructed generation to generation. So there's been a lot of really interesting recent scholarship about, in modern kinship groups, the role of economic or financial or commercial objects as substances of kinship. So this is a really interesting article by Katie Kilroy-Merrick. It's about hoarders. Do we know hoarders? People who hoard objects. And she's interviewing a lot of what are, in the article termed, adult children of hoarders. And they're thinking about, okay, they belong to these kind of kinship groups, and in a strange way, the objects that are hoarded in their kind of family homes become part of the kinship group. So it's about, including the kind of hoard of whatever it is as part of the family or kin group, but also being part of a kin group means not just having a relation to a shared substance, in this case the hoard, but following a kind of code. And the code is, often imposed by the parents, we're not going to sell these things. We're not going to have a yard sale and get rid of all the stuff that's been hoarded. So there's a shared substance, but also a code that regulates how people are supposed to act with regard to the substance. This is stuff that's been sort of taken out of exchange. We're going to keep it in the house, and that's the code you have to follow in order to remain in this kin group. So there's a couple other really interesting articles that argue along the same lines. So this one is about transnational families, so families that are based in Nepal that may have members in the United States and other parts of the world, and they're sending money, cash back, or other forms of money, and so there's a lot of language among these families that kind of blends the difference between the blood they share and the money that they're exchanging or sending back to Nepal, the home base of the family. And there's something sort of similar going on with Indian migrants who've migrated to the Gulf countries, Gulf states, in particular attempting to acquire gold. for dowries, for the use in dowries, and this focus around both having a shared substance, gold or cash, or whatever that's being hoarded at home, and then also following the right code are important elements of how kinship is maintained among these people who sometimes are living very far apart from each other in different types of society or different types of world altogether. So kinship in general, but then in particular, substances. What role do substances play? Not just sharing the substance, but following a code that's supposed to regulate how you act with regard to a substance. So then from there I was basically asking, did this kind of way of thinking about kinship, moving away from maybe terms and thinking about substances and codes, is this a good way to think about kinship among enslaved and formerly enslaved people in the Roman world? And I ultimately think yes, to sort of get ahead of it. So again, there's a lot we can say about the Roman economy. I don't have much time, so I'm kind of going to skip through some of this, but if you're interested in this, much to say, talk to me, talk to any of the professors here, and also Dr. Hogan. But basically, yes, if money is to be a substance of kinship, there's a lot of qualifications we have to make about what money in fact was in the Roman world. And so I know this is, if you've ever taken my classes, I often put too much stuff on the PowerPoints. But basically, what I'm getting at here is that a lot of life in the Roman world wasn't monetized, but for certain people it really was. And a lot of those people are the people that we're about to encounter in the piece of evidence that I'll talk through. So enslaved people, in particular enslaved people that themselves did a lot of commercial and financial activity. So just keep this kind of qualification in mind. Not everyone is dealing with money, but some people really were. And those people also in a very real way lived the life of being commodities. So again, apologies to kind of skip through this, but let's go to the next slide. So all right, so the case studies that I'm looking at come from a novel called The Satirica of Petronius, also sometimes called the Satyricon. So this is a fragmentary novel that probably comes from about 60 CE, and it contains characters who are fictional, and yet a lot of what is said about these fictional characters it parallels what we know about real people in the Roman world, especially from epigraphical sources, inscriptions. So it's basically the story of a wealthy freedman by the name of Trimalchio, who has a huge banquet. We've talked about banquets today. And so he has a banquet that he puts on for various people. And in the banquet, there's dinner conversation, and a lot of this revolves around life and death, thinking about ways to belong in life and also ways to belong after death, and then also various commercial activities. So what I ended up arguing is that these conversations are essentially about kinship, and they're about forming kinship based around both taking part in commercial and financial objects, namely money, and money invested at interest, and then also following codes that regulate how people respond to these objects. So I've argued this in a chapter there's a small snippet from here, but we don't have so much time, so I'll just kind of skip over the key things. But basically the reason why I thought this was a good argument to make is because you have these characters in this novel, and again, they parallel real life examples, but these are people who were bought and sold, within the biographies that they tell about themselves in the novel, but a lot of them have become freed from slavery, and in particular, a lot of them were formerly used for sex in their early life. So they kind of have this very intimate knowledge of commodification, of their bodies being something that's valued in slave markets, and like a sort of dollar amount is put on it. But then after freedom from slavery, they sort of turn around and become very proud of their own financial and commercial savvy. And in particular, Trimalchio, one of the things he does, he buys the estate that his former master owned. So he sort of acquires all the property that he used to be part of. I saw this as a way, and then they're buying, slaves of their own to sort of train to become financially and commercially savvy. So just to go back, and I'll come back to this, but one of the things I got from this article, I mean, when you hear a word like kinship, a lot of the times it's generally seen as a very positive thing. But this article in particular helped me to understand how kinship networks can also be spaces of sort of violence and coercion. And so understanding this kind of kinship networks that I see in the lives of these formerly enslaved people, there is a strong element of violence and coercion that has to be taken into account. In particular, when it comes to sort of, the cycle of violence that comes back upon the next generation of enslaved people in the novel, but again, parallels what we know a lot about from real life. So I know that's a lot to take in. Let me just conclude with some passages. So this is a passage where they're kind of reminiscing. One of their friends, or I'm not really a friend, but someone in their social milieu, a man named Chrysanthus, has recently died. And so they're sort of talking about his life and how he lived his life. And it says, what does he have to complain about? He grew up from $1. This is my translation of the Latin phrase ab assa. He grew up from $1 and was ready to pick a quarter out of shit with his teeth. Whatever he touched grew in the same way, just as honeycomb. I swear he left behind a solid 100,000 sesterces, and he had it all in liquid assets. So you get this image of this man who's like, so desperate to get ahead that he's picking coins out of just like poop on the ground. But that's kind of, in a sense, like his essence, who he is. He's also sort of, he's basically a sort of coin man, or he's kind of got this, what I would characterize as a kinship relation to coins. And so then when he dies, he doesn't have, family in the sort of standard Roman sense of wife and children and other people. He just leaves behind cash that he's grown in the course of his life. So that's something we see over and over again. And we also see it with Trimalchio. So this is kind of the passage where he describes, he's got a wife, a woman named Fortunata, but they don't have children together. Instead, what they do, instead of producing children, they just produce a fortune. So, including the estates that once owned him. So he sort of buys the estates that were formerly, that he belonged to as a kind of slave, and then from there, he immediately bought back all the estates which had belonged to my old master. I build a house, I purchase slaves, I invest in draft animals. Whatever I would touch would grow just as honeycomb. So they're using this phrase, just as honeycomb, over and over again to express kind of the growth of various investments. And once I reached the point of owning more than this, the whole country of mine, I took my hand from the account book, I retired myself from commerce, and began lending money at interest through my freedmen. So this kind of this cycle that repeats generation to generation that I'm characterizing as a kinship that's based on taking part in these substances together, commercial and financial objects, in particular coins, and then also following a sort of code or being imprinted with a code that is enforced through the mechanisms of Roman slavery. So I know that's a lot, I know it's been a long day, but that in essence is my project. So.
That's very, very interesting. And when you talked about hoarding and how these objects become your kin, I will put you in touch with a colleague of ours. I don't know if you know his work. He just published about his parents. His name is Eric Greenberg.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So he published 3 books about his parents being hoarders and how this was so huge that, he couldn't even get in the house. So you can read about that, but this is also cultural part of why would you do this? Why do you identify with all these objects that become your kind of extension and you cannot let go of them or exchange them?
I've just known people who, I had a friend in high school who was a family that hoarded, and it was, you had to sort of weave your way through the house, and then it was like very much, a sort of sibling rivalry between my friend and the hoard. In a strange way, for like who gets more affection from the parents.
Yes, that's true.
Sorry, I didn't see Kristen Jordan.
Awesome.
A question about like what do you make of all the slave boys around as commodities? And you're right that Fortunata and Trimalchio don't have kids, but maybe they're hueri slaves as kind of functioning as children and commodity, maybe depending on their names, like what, thrice wealthy and Fortunata, kind of, do you make anything out of their, I don't know, how they make use of their slaves? I'm thinking of the slave boy whose hair is used as a washcloth early on.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean it's very significant with Trimalchio and Fortunae. He at one point he's talking about how he wants his funerary monument to look, and it's going to be him and Fortunata, and in between will be his favorite slave boy. So they're setting up a sort of two monument in his mind that's something that you might see with a sort of a family in you know other literary depictions, but also in many examples. So I mean, it partly could just be explained by these are people who become freed at a point after which they can no longer have children. And so in the Roman world, there are other mechanisms to acquire a family. Adoption would be the more common one, but then maybe they're using just buying humans as a sort of surrogate. But yeah, I mean, these things are very disturbing to think about the way that they get blended together into these families that, you know, as a historian, you have to sort of describe it for what it is without, you know, glossing over the ugliness or the exploitation and violence, but also, you know, trying to understand how, again, fictional people, but paralleled in real life, arrived at the point of attempting to form kinships in this way. Yeah. Sorry, Jordan.
Thank you for that excellent talk. I have about 15 questions, but for reasons of time, I'll ask just one, and then I guess I'll approach you privately for the other ones. I'm fascinated by this concept of substances of kinship. And on your list, all of these things are things that humans have more or less had for 10,000 years or so and sold conceptually. But monetization of the economy is something that we can trace has a beginning in Roman society. So I'm wondering, have you noticed in your research a sort of difference of how slaves conceive of themselves, how they conceive of substances in a pre-monetary versus a post-monetary economy? Does that change the discourse or behavior at all?
Well, I guess I would say mostly what I've looked at is sort of post-monetary. I'm sort of, the next point for this project is to go back to the comedies of Plautus and Terence. And so that's in a moment when you're kind of you're like on the cusp of monetization, especially then like following the Second Punic War, because there's just more specie floating around in Italy. I would guess yes, and it does, but it's hard to, with this way of thinking about kinship, I mean, because you know, apart from like just there being more cash in the economy or more monetization of life, prior to that, I don't quite understand the history of this. There's the use of currency amounts to enumerate wealth in the census. So in a sense, like kinship is already being valued in the census in the Roman world in, I don't know, dollar amounts, to put it in modern terms. But I don't quite understand how that, like how secure our knowledge is of the earliest phases of that. Yeah, that's something I need to look into.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Barrett.
Yes, phenomenon of mutuality of being is really, really fascinating. Can you see this manifesting in other aspects of life as well, or in different sort of clades of people, or is this very specifically a sort of free slave dynamic?
No, I think it does have, I mean, like, I guess you could, I mean, what you were, Clara, especially what you're talking about, like, with like, worship of chthonic deities. But also, I mean, it's just kind of the background with Roman religion, that part of, especially ancestor funerary cults involve partaking in certain, like wine and first fruits and things like that. So I think, I mean, yes, I think it pre-exists the use of money in this way, or possible use of money in this way. I mean, then it's also important to say with coins, I mean, like, coins were a space where visually the emperors would trace their own kinship networks or familial networks, including various members of the family on coins. So in addition to like money being used, there's this sort of numismatic component.
Well, wonderful job. Thank you, Elliot. And I think at this point you also gave me a couple of words that I want to end this wonderful day with. So you gave me the word belong and belong. So I wanted to first of all welcome all the families who were here. And as I say thank you to the graduating seniors, know that you always belong. And that you will always belong. Your memory will be with us in every possible way. And we hope that you will, wherever you are, keep in touch and come back. And if you ever make it to the symposium, you have a space reserved. Okay, so thank you all again, and such a wonderful day. Wonderful.